Good morning and welcome to the 10th meeting of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee in 2026. Before we begin, can I ask everyone to ensure that all electronic devices are switched to silent. Our first item on the agenda is to decide whether to consider our annual and legacy reports in private at our next meeting. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. Our next item on the agenda today is to conclude our work assessing progress made since our follow-up inquiry by taking evidence from the Scottish Government on salmon farming. And I welcome to the meeting this morning Mairi Goujon, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands, and her officials. This morning we have Jill Barber, who's the Head of Aquaculture Development, Hazel Bartels, the Senior Delivery Lead from Farm Fish Health and Innovation, and Charles Allen, who's the Senior Delivery Lead for Aquaculture, Fish Health and Biosecurity. I also welcome to the meeting Edward Mountain, who will bring in at the end to ask his questions, and I hand over to Edward to make his declaration of interest.
Thank you, Convener. I just would like to remind committee members and members of the public that in my register of interest I am shown as being a joint owner of a wild salmon fishery on the River Spey. The River Spey is on the east coast of Scotland and not directly affected by salmon farming on the west coast of Scotland. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr Mountain. And I now hand over to the Cabinet Secretary to make a brief opening statement.
And good morning, committee members. And just to say, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to update the committee on the progress that we've made just over 1 year on from your report on salmon farming in Scotland. Now, we took the recommendations that were in the committee's report seriously, and following careful consideration, I set out a targeted programme in response, including how best to make progress on the issues that were raised, supported by evidence, and in what order. I am really grateful for the committee's insights, as well as to our stakeholders more broadly, for their input to help us make effective prioritisation decisions, as well as for advancing the conversation on the sustainable future of salmon farming in Scotland, to which, of course, this government remains fully committed. Firstly, on fish health and welfare, I think particularly the concerns that some sites were experiencing persistent high mortality. Scottish Government scientists, fish health experts and policy officials have worked at pace to deliver a robust analytical framework to determine if such sites exist, what actions are being taken by producers to tackle such mortality, and ultimately to evidence if further government intervention is required beyond our existing regulation. The preliminary conclusion is that persistent elevated mortality isn't a systemic issue for Scottish marine salmon sites. Only a small fraction of sites were identified as having such mortality, and the work showed all producers already take a considerable range of responsible and prompt actions to tackle and reduce persistent mortality where it occurs. So, as a result, I don't believe that further regulatory action is warranted at this time. It's still Scottish Government's position, shared by industry, that mortality should be should be managed to the lowest possible levels. We continue to support the sector through different work streams, including facilitating the science, innovation and strategic approaches necessary to address those challenges. On fish welfare, I've already committed to progress welfare standards for farmed fish under the Animal Welfare Scotland Act 2006. Delivery is going to be progressed this year by working with stakeholders in the farm fish sector, as well as veterinary experts, regulators and animal welfare organisations, to deliver guidance which is both robust as well as operationally feasible. And we are also strengthening enforcement of farm fish welfare by working with APHA to increase the number of trained fish inspectors, increase the number of inspections carried out per year, and require those inspections to focus on adherence to those welfare standards. To improve transparency across the sector, SEPA has updated Scotland's aquaculture website to provide better access to important data and information. They've also launched a discovery project to prototype a new digital solution for coordinated regulation, with the aim of rolling this out next year. And meanwhile, we've published a mortality data topic sheet to enhance the understanding and use of all the data that's published regarding fish health. In terms of spatial planning and consenting, we've delivered on a programme for government commitment to confirm local planning authorities as responsible for fish farm planning controls, and SEPA is the lead regulator for fish farm discharges within the 3 to 12 nautical mile zone, future-proofing regulation as fish farms look to move into more exposed locations. We've also adopted Scotland's first regional marine plans for the Shetland Island region in December last year and Orkney just in February. This marks a significant milestone for marine planning in Scotland and enables a community-led approach to marine spatial planning to reflect local circumstances. And we've also worked to support more proposals into our fish farm consenting pilots operating in Shetland and Highland local authority areas, and we're addressing the recommendations of an initial evaluation exercise. The Scottish Government is highly supportive of sector innovation. Work to ensure the activities of the Sustainable Aquaculture Innovation Centre continue effectively into the future is near completion. We've also continued to work with SEPA to implement a supporting monitoring programme to the sea lice regulatory framework, examining sea trout on the West Coast, Western Isles and Orkney last year. And the programme will be enhanced this year with the support of Scottish Government. Now, while there are appeals relating to elements of SEPA's framework, appeal mechanisms are part of a fair consenting system and due process will be followed. And to ensure Scotland is taking the right approach for the longer term, our Chief Scientific Advisor for Marine is also working to consider the scientific underpinning of SEPA's sea lice framework. And shortly drawn to a close, Convener, I think it's important to finish finally on the value of salmon farming in Scotland. The latest Scottish Fish Farm Production Survey reported that in 2024, salmon farming achieved a production value of over £1.3 billion, and HMRC statistics reveal that salmon exports were worth £828 million in 2025. We know that the sector generated £468 million in gross value added in 2023 and supports over 11,000 jobs across the wider supply chain. But I think beyond these headline statistics, the sector also supports community benefit through its contribution to the Scottish Consolidated Fund, which is distributed to coastal local authorities. Now, we know that, as ever, there is always more work to do, and while I'm very pleased to discuss progress in the last 12 months with you here today, we are going to continue to deliver our work programme set out in response to the committee's report, and with that, I'm happy to take any questions that the committee might have.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. So we've allocated approximately 2 hours for this session. As expected, we've got quite a few questions to get through, so if we could have succinct questions and answers, that will help. So I'm going to kick off. I'm going to look at mandatory mortality reporting. It's an issue that remains central not only to fish health and environmental protection, but also, equally importantly, to confidence in the agriculture sector and its long-term sustainability. So back in January 2025, the committee set out clear and practical recommendations aimed at reducing persistently high mortality in Scottish salmon farms. One of the things we called for was stronger regulatory powers for the likes of the Fish Health Inspectorate, specifically to have the ability to limit or halt production at sites experiencing consistently high mortality rates. The committee recommended the establishment of agreed mortality thresholds that would trigger interventions, such as improved environmental risk modelling and so on. We also looked at cleaner fish and freshwater losses. However, there were real concerns about transparency and how lack of transparency had an impact on public confidence. We heard this would be a burden on the industry. So Cabinet Secretary, why do you consider an administrative burden is more important than ensuring transparency and public confidence in the industry?
I wouldn't say it's a case of that being more of well, I think there's a few points in terms of the issues that you've raised, first of all, Convener, that I will try to address. But it's not about saying that the burden is more important than ensuring transparent and public confidence. And I think the points that I've been trying to make at previous committee appearances, as well as in response to some of the recommendations that came from the committee's report and previous inquiry, is just the level of data that is already published. And the salmon farming sector is very transparent in that regard, I think, especially in comparison to other sectors in terms of the volume and quantity of information that is published in relation to mortality data. In response to the committee, we also sent over a topic sheet as part of the recent letter that I sent there, because I do think part of the issue is how some of that data can be communicated, how easy it is to navigate. Obviously, we collect that data for different purposes and different organisations collect it, which I think adds to that wider landscape. So there have been a number of different pieces of work that have been done. First of all, in terms of the Scotland's Aquaculture website, which was raised by the committee previously, trying to make that a bit more intuitive, user-friendly, easier to navigate some of the information that's there. We continue to collect that information for the different purposes, as I set out in my response to the committee's letter. But I do think it's important to remember that if we are looking to mandate or regulate for more information, we need to ask the question, why do we need it? I think from what you've heard from previous evidence to the committee, and particularly from the regulators and other bodies, is that we get the information that we need for the purposes of satisfying the regulations that we have at the moment. We don't feel there is that need to collect further information beyond what is already there. But also within that, though, I would say that you touched on some of the comments that were made around, I think, the cleaner fish data and information on that. Obviously, there's been a lot of work that's been undertaken over the course of this past year. We've had the report from the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission, which talks about various pieces of work that need to be done there. There was also I know that Ben Hadfield had said in his evidence to committee last week there was more information that they would be looking to furnish with, and I do think cleaner fish is one area where I think it would be helpful to have more of that information and data. But again, I believe that we have the data there for the purposes that we need it for, and over and above that, there is an awful lot of information that's already published and available.
I think that's the real issue here. We know that individual farms collect a lot more data than they're mandated to do or publish as part of their good animal husbandry and animal welfare and the general management of the sites. But that data, if it was mandatory, it would give more confidence that data was accurate. We did ask for industry and regulators to agree mortality thresholds to trigger intervention. Because that's key to this. It's to make sure that fish farms that are not performing or have regularly high levels of mortality are dealt with or moved or whatever. So why was there not a targeted enforcement powers? I beg your pardon. Why were the thresholds not developed as part of the framework which would trigger intervention?
Sorry, you mean in relation to the model that was sent to the committee on persistent high mortality?
Yeah, so we can model it, but there was no mortality thresholds identified that would trigger government intervention.
Well, first of all, I think there's a point that I want to come back to in relation to there not being trust in the information that's there, because I would say that obviously the powers that the FHI have, and I don't know whether Charles will want to come in on this in a minute, is they have access to that information. If we had concerns about that, we wouldn't be publishing information that wasn't accurate. Of course, occasionally there can be mistakes made, but they would be swiftly corrected. So we do have the trust in the information that is there and that is made publicly available. And more of those records, of course, are available for inspection by the FHI. Now, in relation to the modelling work that was sent to committee, I think there's a few relevant points there. First of all, based on the recommendations that came from the committee last year, we had to try and establish, well, what is persistent high mortality? What does that look like? How do we try and assess it? And that's what the model that's been presented to the committee is about. And it also provided a bit of an update last year, just in terms of some of the terms that we were considering, and to really get committee's thoughts on that too. What I would say is, though, that the modelling work that's been presented to committee, it hasn't been peer-reviewed. It's still going through that process. But, of course, there has been extensive work that's gone into that modelling. So I'll probably ask Charles and Hazel to come in, who can provide a bit more of the detail in relation to that, if that would be helpful.
Yeah. Do you want to, on the persistent elevated mortality work? So in order to... The recommendation was to regulate in relation to sites that have persistent elevated mortality. We considered that it's not relevant to regulate on something without understanding what persistent elevated mortality means. So the analytical framework was developed in order to explore that concept, in order to work through what that could mean within Scotland, and to understand the shape of the data with regard to that. So that work was done in order to flag at a statistically significant level what persistence might mean or what elevated might mean within that context. And that information has been set out to you in September and then in the recent update as well. it's quite challenging to work out what that might mean. There's an element of judgment in that level, but again, we were working with our analytical experts and with our fish health experts as well to come up with a meaningful number on that, which is why the level has been set the way that it has. It should be said that the 90th percentile set within that analysis is sort of drawn out of the data. There is a number associated with that. Obviously, there's that works out to a percentage within the sort of array of information that we're talking about. But that's kind of drawn from the data, looking at sort of relative performance within the sector to understand, where the outliers are within that. So it's a statistical piece of work rather than a kind of rather than trying to set something from outside on that. Do you want to talk about that a bit more?
I suppose, can I come in? So, yeah, I absolutely take on board that the government has advanced analytical understanding of mortality, but this is where the approach falls short and is not adequate or sufficient against the committee's recommendations, because it avoids any regulatory or proactive modelling to deal with it. So, is it something that you're going to develop? So once you understand what the persistent high mortality is, and you can say this is what it is, and it triggers a threshold, are you intending to introduce regulatory proceedings?
We're trying to make. So first of all, before determining if we needed to regulate, we need to discover, is there a problem and how do we define these terms that are used? So again, the model that we've presented is about identifying what is persistent high mortality. Does it exist? And is it identifying a problem then based on the modelling that we have, which then means that if it identifies a problem, we would then look to take further regulatory action. But again, it's still in the process of peer review, but from the outcomes of that modelling, and as it's set out in the paper too, there doesn't appear to be a systemic issue across salmon farms in Scotland with persistent high mortality, in terms that when that was identified in the few farms, action had been taken to immediately address it. So again, if there was a systemic problem there, that could have potentially been the next recommendation, would be to look at, right, do we need to regulate, do we need to introduce measures here? But again, that's why this piece of work was so critical.
And I think just to add to that, the next question that we have to ask ourselves as policymakers around that is there a problem, and would regulation change behaviour in such a way that would be beneficial? But
it's not just about changing behaviour. If we find farms that regularly have high mortality rates, they need to be closed down.
I'm sorry, but it's not as straightforward as that. And again, that's why the modelling work that is here was so important, because if there was identified problems, it was hopeful that this would provide the recommendations as to next steps and what that would be. But again, what the modelling has found, and as that has been set out to committee, is that it's not a systemic issue, because wherever mortality events were identified, action had been taken swiftly by the producers to try and address that. And as we know, there are a wide variety of causes that lead to that as well. So again, that's why this piece of work is critical. But it's still to go through that full process. There could well be changes on the back of it. And of course, we will be keeping the committee updated on that work as it progresses.
So my next question is the committee recommended mandatory mortality reporting, and we've heard that the government are not providing that to the level it would like. But in your update to the committee on the 5th of March, which provided the mortality data set explainer, as it's described, it highlights that, and I quote, "Understanding the reasons for losses within food production is an important part of responsible farming and to ensure transparency." It then goes on to say that no single data set provides a complete picture across the entire production cycle. Does that not, in those two sentences, not reinforce the committee's recommendation for comprehensive mandatory reporting of mortality, which you've rejected?
No, but I would say that we've rejected the mandation of it because that information is available and we have it. And I think before you're introducing regulation, I mean, these would be part of the steps that we would go through, whether it's for this, whether it's other areas. And when you're working through your big business and regulatory impact assessments and all the various pieces of work you have to do in developing regulation, the first questions you ask are, well, what other means have we tried? What other options have we considered? So again, if we had a problem in accessing information or from the reporting that is currently there, again, we would consider regulation. And that's what, again, coming back to persistent high mortality work was about. It was like, well, is there an issue here? Do we need to look at whatever, we'll consider whatever next steps might be. But again, we feel we don't need to mandate for the collection of that data because the data is already there, it's published, and we don't have a problem with the collection of that. Sorry, Hazel.
So just to add to that specific, on the specific quote you've just given there, which is the data sets, none of them was collected in order to do the piece of analytical work that we have then used them for. That they are adequate to the purposes that they are created for, but they were not created for this. So I think that's the kind of the detail that sits behind that. So a lot of work in the early phases of the analysis was done in terms of stitching that information together, and actually those three data sets and our ability to use them to sort of sense check one another adds to the robustness and the validity of the analysis. To sort of understand those, to get that kind of corroboration from those other data sets as well. Yeah.
I suppose if we want to compare what our recommendations were and what was actually delivered, I'll run through some. So the committee recommended that Fish Health Inspectorate had powers to halt or limit production at high mortality sites, but the government has suggested that no legislative control is justified. We wanted there to be an agreement on mortality thresholds agreed with industry and regulators. But what we've got is internal definitions used for analysis and not for any sort of regulatory thresholds to be identified. We don't have government-led modelling of environmental drivers. We don't have a comprehensive publication of mortality data for cleaner fish and so on. We asked for an annual fish health report. We didn't have a commitment from the government to do that. And while, again, I reinforce this, we've got analytical framework, and that analytical framework actually identifies 9 sites, but there is no regulatory follow-through to deal with it. And again, the transparency is the big issue, where we don't have a single data set which allows the public to have confidence that the data provided is actually, shows that there's improvements in the industry. So there's a whole range of different reasons why we're not confident the government actually delivered what the committee recommended a year ago.
There that I think it's vital for me to try and address in some of the areas that you've listed there, Convener. I think, first of all, it comes back to, again, I wouldn't have hesitated to come back here, depending on the outcome of the modelling, to say, right, OK, we are going to potentially look at regulation in this space, or what other measures we need to do to collect information. But I think what was so critical in our response to the committee in the previous year was that we need to do the work to see, how do we determine this? How do we discover this if there is an issue? Again, that's where the modelling work was done, and that's what we've presented to committee. Again, it's still to be peer reviewed. We'll work through that process, but from the initial outcomes of that model, it was found that there wasn't a systemic issue that we then needed regulation to try and address. Now, we haven't said that, oh yeah, the whole data picture is complete. Again, I've outlined in my previous response as well. And on the back of the work that, again, was commissioned, also because of the work that the committee's done from the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission, because we know that there are gaps there in relation to cleaner fish in particular, and that's where that would be a focus for the coming year, looking at, well, what other information do we need to publish? Understand that Salmon Scotland have written to the committee since their appearance here a couple of weeks ago to outline information they'd be looking to publish. So, again, we'd be looking to enter into further discussions with them too. And when it comes to the recommendation that was made on the Fish Health Report, again, there is so much information out there. Ultimately, what that would mean is, and it would require some resource to put together, if we were to compile a fish health report, I think it was the comparison was within Norway, but again, we're not comparing like with like in terms of the information that's already published and publicly available. We would just be reformatting the information that is already publicly available. So, again, that information is there. But if that's a recommendation from the committee that they want us to look at, putting the resource into reformatting that into a different way, we'd consider that. But then, of course, given the pressures that we're under with the resourcing and trying to ensure that we are delivering on all the commitments that we made to the committee as well, I would question, well, would there be the value in that, and how would we prioritise that work?
Yeah, and finally from me, we've had stakeholders suggest, including Animal Equality UK, have highlighted record high mortality rates in 2025. So what is your basis for the conclusion that persistent elevated mortality is not systemic? And does it not risk downplaying the issues that the sector and stakeholders continue to raise?
Not at all. Again, that's a scientific piece of work that we've put to the committee. And again, I'm sure Charles and Hazel can talk a bit more about the modelling that's behind that and how all of that was identified and some of the information that was interrogated to look at it. I don't think there's any question that mortality levels have been too high. You know, we've talked about that at committee previously. It is within everyone's interests, and I would absolutely expect them to be driven to the lowest level possible, because it's not good for fish and health and welfare. It's just not good for the businesses themselves to see such high mortality rates. But I think what's also important to remember is just the variety of different factors and causes that can lead to that aren't necessarily always within the control of the fish farmer themselves. We're seeing changing climatic conditions and various other events that can contribute to some of the mortalities that we've seen. Again, that's why the work was so important, though, because it was about looking at, well, what are the causes? What action was taken by fish farmers on the back of that? Did they try and address it? And of course, with the work and the investment that we're putting into innovation, is about trying to get ahead of these challenges as well, trying to see, well, what could be coming further down the line? How do we try and predict some of that, as well as then prevent some of that going forward? And that is where the key focus of the industry is, and also where our focus is and all the collaboration that we're taking forward in relation to the science on that.
Okay, thank you. Alistair Allen.
You've touched on this one, but there is a question that the committee also raised, which is about the accessibility of data, and reference was made there by way of comparison with Norway and fish health reports. I mean, I appreciate the point you just made about resources and so on, but is there more that can be done to make the data available in a single accessible source?
Again, well, I would say the main focus of that is Scotland's aquaculture website, which is where that information can largely be found. And as I touched on in a previous response, and I think as we discussed at committee previously as well, is that I think part of the problem is just being able to access that in an intuitive way, because there is a lot of information out there, and I think there has been a piece of work to do in relation to how accessible that is and available it is to the public as well. So there have been improvements that have been made to Scotland's aquaculture website to make it more intuitive to access that information as well. Jill, I don't know if there's more that you want to add in terms of some of the specifics or in relation to what's happened on the website, but I would hope that if any committee members had used it, you would find it that easier to navigate and to reach the information that you're trying to find.
It's the Scotland's Aquaculture website was done to make it more user-friendly, as the Cabinet Secretary says. I think the availability of information and what's there has been an ongoing bit of work. So in 2024, there was medicine use, antimicrobials, hydrogen peroxide added by SEPA into the website. There's now been the mortality narrative to explain what the data sets are and why. And I think when SEPA was here, they talked about their environmental performance scheme that's coming as well, which should link into Scotland's Aquaculture website. And we've also got our digital consenting project as well. So everything should be able to link back to the farm and site, but it is a bit of an ongoing process in how that data is displayed and accessed. But we're committed to that.
Cute. Convener.
I think my question's actually just been answered, because it was about what improvements the public could see. So I think my question's been answered.
Thank you. Emma Roddick.
Cabinet Secretary, I'm concerned that in terms of the mortality figures that we're looking at and scrutinising, they're still not complete. We still cannot see mortalities in freshwater during transport, in the 6-week transfer period, or, as you mentioned, cleaner fish during culling. How can we accurately measure how ethical the industry is and how sustainable it is if we just don't know and we're only seeing one small part of the mortality picture?
Well, first of all, I would disagree. I wouldn't say it's just one small part of the bigger picture that's being published. Again, there's data is collected in a number of different ways by the FHI, by SEPA, by ourselves, as well as the monthly survival information that's published by Salmon Scotland. And again, there is a lot of information that's published there which meets the regulatory needs that we have in relation to that too. In relation to, I think, some of the other areas that you've talked about there, again, cleaner fish, we recognise it as a broader area. And as I touched on in a previous response, And I think the commitment that was made by Salmon Scotland in the recent correspondence with committee, we want to engage with them on that to see more of the cleaner fish data, because I think that is already accessible to some of that information is already accessible to the Fish Health Inspectorate already. But again, I think the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission and their recommendations have highlighted where some of those gaps are, where more research needs to be done. So that would be a focus for the coming year in seeing how we can make some of that information more transparent and build up and look at some of those research areas that they've suggested to going forward. On culling, I would say that, again, that would be... that overall picture would be captured within the production survey that we have, because that's from survival to harvest. But again, we would have to ask, well, why would we be looking to collect that information? We don't collect it for any other sector. So in terms of the specifics on that part of information. But Charles, I don't know if there's anything else you would want to add in relation to some of the data.
I think I would just add something. You refer specifically to culls, transport and fresh water. And as the Cabinet Secretary alluded to, all of those figures are provided in the annual production survey. So you do get a read across from input and output, and the difference between the two is the loss within the production area.
Okay, and you're confident that that is total? There's not
Absolutely.
anything missing from there?
And it's the longest contiguous reporting of annual production anywhere in the world. It goes back to the 1970s.
And are we able, using that data, to pinpoint whether there are locational, geographical difficulties or particular farms or operators that...
Not down to the farm level. Certainly in seawater production, there is a lot of... The data is analysed in a lot of different, or presented in a lot of different ways, and quite a lot of that data is presented regionally.
Yeah. So it still seems like if there are issues, if there were a systemic issue, it would be very hard to spot using that data.
If there were a systemic issue, it would not be possible to spot using that data. But I could take you to data which is published by Fish Health Inspectorate, which is everything above threshold, and that runs to several thousand data points.
Going back to the Cabinet Secretary's... Sorry.
Oh, sorry, just because I think there's another important point to raise there. Sorry, Jo.
I think we've been discussing confidence in the data and that things are being followed up. And I think when AFA and FHI were here, they were saying we have the data we need, we're going out to site, we're inspecting, we can access the data. So they're doing that bit. And then there's these additional tools like the voluntary mortality reporting that goes to FHI, which the FHI will follow up. And then there's been all this additional data at site level. So it is transparent so people can see it, but it's also, there's different numbers, so people are looking to try and understand what those mean in the context. So I think the persistent mortality work, so over and above those inspections, the regulators were quite content that they know what they're seeing, and they've done the persistent mortality as an additional tool to say, we don't think this is happening, we don't think persistent mortality or poor decision making is a problem, but let's look through the data, and it's broadly come out as would have been expected.
So in the last session, Professor Dwyer said that mandatory mortality reporting is important in relation to livestock welfare issues. And given that it's clear that a lot of data on mortalities is collected at that site level, and in many cases that data also includes the cause of death, including for cleaner fish, do you agree that that data should be published by the Marine Directorate?
Well, I think there's a few points in there. I think, again, on the cleaner fish, we want to see what information is there. And I think there's a difference between what is voluntarily, published by the sector as opposed to, why information that then becomes a burden on us to collect, validate and look to publish ourselves. Again, I would come back to the point that we receive all the data we need for the purposes that we need it for, and we have absolute confidence in that data. But again, we know there are areas where we need to look at more information, transparency, and again, Cleaner Fish is identified as one of those.
Tim Eagle.
Thank you, Convener. So, I was going to ask a few of the questions that Emma Roddick's just picked up on there, but I think I'm missing. I want to be absolutely clear, because we've got to finalise this report at the end of this as to what the updates have been. Is the data? So we have data for individual fish farms, yes, but we don't publicise that data.
The sector publish site-specific information.
The data you hold, do you publish?
Yes.
Yes. So all of that data is out there, but it's not comparable easily.
Well, again, it's collected for different reasons, which is why we have that explainer as to how the data is collected and published.
There's two major data sets that we as Marine Directorate publish. And one is the production survey, which summarises production on a year class basis. And then there's the FHI data set, which is related to their inspection regime. And those two, so they're for different purposes. And you can't, one is a kind of a stock measure, one is a flow measure. They're just different. Yeah. They're for different reasons. And you learn different things from those different data sets. And that's kind of what we're looking to set out in the topic sheet that we shared with you. We don't hold back anything from that information when we are publishing those two data sets. At the farm level, obviously, the farmers have tons of information at that local, detailed level that goes way beyond what it would make sense for us to interrogate from the regulatory position that the FHI is sitting in. But it is absolutely available to fish health inspectors on farms when it's requested.
You accept, though, I think this committee is great, but it's not the opening night of a blockbuster. Yet we've got a public gallery packed today, because public confidence in the sector, I think, is at its lowest at the moment. So people are genuinely very interested. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is those two things. One is the data available enough in a readily accessible format that we can ensure that everybody there can get access to that and understand what's going on in a good picture across Scotland? And we're not there yet, are we?
Well, I believe that we are. I believe that we publish that information. It's easily accessible. And again, that's what Scotland's Aquaculture website is about pulling that information together and making sure that people can navigate it and that it is more accessible to people. Again, I think when we're looking at the transparency of the sector, there is more information requested and published by the sector than any other sector in terms of comparison. But I think, that broader point about can people understand it, easily interrogate it? Again, I think that's where what we've set out in terms of our response to the committee's recommendations is really trying to get at. Now, there are improvements to be made. I've said that. We know there are areas where there are evidence gaps, and there is also work that's being undertaken by SEPA that, again, will help complete that overall picture of farm performance that's coming down the line. But again, I believe that we publish an awful lot of that information. It's already in the public domain. But as I put that question back to committee in relation to the specific recommendation, essentially, I think some of those recommendations are about repackaging information that's already in existence, because, again, we publish everything that we need to.
Do one more quick question. So can I go on to persistent high mortality then? So you've repeatedly this morning said that you don't think there is persistent high mortality, but yet we don't set a figure on what is high mortality, because at the original evidence session that you came into, you really didn't think that was a helpful conversation to have. But our mortality is significantly higher than other countries, and I know you would argue that that's not directly comparable, but we do have a mortality that seems to be worse than other countries. Is that not evidence in itself that we have a problem that needs to be addressed?
Again, I only say you're not comparing like with like, because obviously there are very different farming conditions and different salmon farming.
But we do have repeated evidence of significant mortality into the 80%, but also mortality that is 20 to 30%, whereas Norway are trying to keep that into that sort of 5 to 15 range.
Again, I've also said as well that we believe that mortality rate is too high. I just think that, you could set a threshold. You could say that, as other countries have done. But what is that driving at, and what change would that affect, or what work would that encourage that isn't already happening at the moment? Because, again, as I've said, mortality needs to be driven to the absolute lowest levels. Yeah. And that's what we would be expecting, and we know that all businesses are working to achieve. Again, that modelling was a really important piece of work which still hasn't quite reached its full conclusion. It's still being peer reviewed, as I've highlighted in previous responses, because we were trying to identify, right, is there a systemic issue here that we do need to try and address on the back of the previous recommendations from the committee? And I think what that modelling has suggested is there isn't a systemic issue in Scotland, because wherever a problem was identified, an attempt was made to address it or to try and fix whatever led to those specific events occurring. But I mean, if the report had said something different, of course we would have taken, whatever action came out on the back of that. But that initial work was important because we needed to identify what is persistent high mortality. Is that a problem in Scotland that we need to try and fix?
And the report doesn't say there was no mortality. It looks at what mortality has occurred and considers whether the levels or it continues into the future. That's the other thing about the word persistence. It was mortality that continues over time from a related cause. So there's a few nuances in there that are quite important as far as what the report tells us.
I guess I'm trying to get to the day-to-day practicality of this, and it goes back to Finn saying, does a fish farm need to be shut down? And I think you said earlier on, and I wrote it down, you said companies are not in control because of various other factors. But the fact is, surely from the government's point of view, if there is a fish farm in X location in Scotland and the mortality of that is sometimes hitting 60%, but often 20 to 30%, then the government needs to be able to step in and say whether it's not in that company's control or not is irrelevant. If there is environmental conditions, warmer waters, whatever it might be that is causing that mortality, that farm cannot continue. And the government, despite Edward's report coming out in 2018, so that's 8 years ago, has yet to get to a position where they have any system in place really to challenge that on the ground.
Well, first of all, there's a few issues there. If there was a significant mortality event that was, again, over a specific threshold, that's something that the Fish Health Inspectorate would be interrogating and looking at and identifying if there's an issue. So it's not a case of events happen and, it's just left and we're satisfied with that. Yeah. And again, we've been undertaking this work to try and get to grips with, right, is there an issue here that we need to try and fix? But again, you can get these issues, whether it's algal blooms, micro jellyfish that aren't within the control of the fish farmer. So do you then close a farm down because they've had that significant event that they couldn't predict?
One-off, maybe not, but if it's happening year on year on year on year.
This comes back to, I think, the persistence point that we've been talking about and looking at, are there related causes here? And again, is it a systemic problem that we need to try and fix? And that's what the modelling came out and said, that it hasn't found that there is a systemic problem that needs that regulatory fix. So again, I can only present the information as it's been done. But Charles, you want to come in?
If you take the argument that the elevated mortality is what you want to regulate.
Yep.
You could have a farming industry, and please don't quote me on this. You could have the majority of the sector performing at 99% survival, and a small amount of the sector at 98% survival, and that would be seen by the model to be elevated and persistent. And would you want? And I'm not belittling your point about significant mortality occurring, but if you use the model blindly in the elevated section, you could actually be considering quite small mortality. So we need to be mindful of how the model is set up. The outputs that come from that model, and what they tell us, because at the end of the day, that is the output of a model, and you need to be able to truth that against real-life data.
Okay. Thank you for your patience, Camilla.
I'm just concerned listening to what's going on, and obviously I've just read the Scottish Government's press release as well around why it's in everybody's best interest to manage mortality in salmon farms. It just sounds like we're saying the farmers are looking at mass mortality events, they are trying to do something, but it's out with their control. Surely that doesn't make it better from an animal welfare point of view. It doesn't mean the fish haven't died. It doesn't mean that they might not die in a few weeks' time when the same uncontrollable event happens either there or somewhere further up the coast. So surely that plays a part, that ethical standpoint of fish keep dying and we can't stop it.
And of course, we want to try and do that. And I think from my perspective, it's about ensuring, again, what has been done to try and address that, what's been done to try and prevent it, and what action is being taken to try and prevent that from happening again in future, and ensuring that that work is being done. So it's not a case of, all right, okay, everything's fine and people are tackling it. Again, it comes back to the evidence and the data that we see, and going back to the model as well, which has shown, and when those incidents have been interrogated through the various stages of development of that model as well, using the publicly available data, the interrogation from FHI and the data that they've seen, as well as then going to the site operators as well and seeing what action was taken on the ground. We're interrogating all of that to ensure that everything that can be done is being done. And again, we're wanting to make sure that we are addressing these problems because mortality levels have been too high. I think the only point I'm trying to make is that that's not always predictable. It comes back to the work that we're doing and the wider innovation and investment in trying to prevent some of these, whether it's disease, whether it's some climatic events, where we possibly can, and trying to address that.
And there's been progress on that too. So I think we've used the example. It's just a very good one about the predictive work that was a predictive project that was undertaken by the Sustainable Aquaculture Innovation Centre with regard to harmful algal blooms, which is an opportunity which allows a producer to, or a site operator to see, to get an early warning about when that impact is like to strike in their area, and that allows them to then take action to mitigate the effect of that on fish. So that's an exact example of an environmental challenge that innovation is looking to address, and mitigations are now in operation with regard to that. That doesn't mean that something new won't happen. That doesn't mean that it's completely perfect every time, right? But it is absolutely a problem that was identified and a solution managed around that. So that continues to be the case. New problems arise, different problems arise in different places. And it's a question, as the Cabinet Secretary says, of getting ahead of that, of using our innovation and using our science and research to consider how to address those problems as they arise.
But we're not ahead of it. We keep setting new records for mortality rates, and it just sounds like because Scottish salmon is internationally renowned and has a high price tag, we're content with that.
No, I wouldn't say that's the case at all, to be honest, because, again, we are trying to address and challenge that. Now, we did have some very poor survival figures. I think that was from the 2022 year class in particular, which was a very bad year, but some of the most recent figures that we've seen in the monthly mortality data have shown improvements in mortality figures. And again, some of the innovations that have gone into that, Hazel's talked about the work from SAIC and harmful algal blooms. There's all sorts of different developments, whether that's vaccines to prevent diseases, the use of wellboats, and all sorts of other different innovations that are happening at site level as well to try and prevent that. So again, I think it's important that we are taking action to highlight that, because I don't think anybody is satisfied with those figures of mortality, because we all recognise that they are high.
Very conscious. We are probably addressed a fifth of the questions and we're half the way through the session. But I also appreciate that mortality is a key topic. Just carrying on with the theme you touched on there, we're going to move to fish health, welfare and cleaner fish, and a question from Emma Harper.
I think some of it's been touched on already, Convener, but thank you. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. It's really regarding the analytical framework to identify some of the high mortality, and that already has been introduced. Am I correct?
Well, it's a model that we've put forward. Again, we were trying to work at pace to, again, get the definition of persistent high mortality and ensure that we were presenting that to committee. As I say, it's still working its way through the peer review process. But again, it's about the modelling to identify what does persistent high mortality mean, and do we have sites that would meet those definitions.
And farms are already measuring mortality every month.
Yes, there's monthly figures that are published by Salmon Scotland.
Righty. Okay. And obviously, as this process is being modelled and looked at, there will be action that can be taken if it's been identified that a farm has persistent mortality.
Well, from that model, we find that where there were sites that could be reaching that definition, action was taken in relation to each of those events. So again, the modelling that had been done found that there wasn't a systemic issue in that sites had been identified with persistent high mortality, and they weren't then acting on that information or doing anything to tackle mortality where that occurred.
And I know we're going to come on to innovation, and there has been a lot of innovation, so I won't really dwell on it a lot. But in the last session of Parliament, we talked about sea lice a lot, and now we're looking at other things like jellyfish. And so it's rapidly changing when there's challenges, climate change, warming waters as well. So that's all part of the framework to assess what is causing mortality.
Yes, I mean, obviously, but in relation to sea lice, that's managed in a couple of different ways. So there's the sea lice as it relates to the farmed fish health. Then there's also the risk of sea lice to wild salmon as well. And that was the work that was being developed by SEPA for the sea lice framework, and that was getting put in place there. But again, there's been an awful lot of work that's taken place in each of these areas, either to try and identify what challenges are leading to some of these events, to try and get ahead of that. And there's also work in various partnerships that we're engaged in, and various scientific bodies that are collaborating on work to try and address and, as I say, get ahead of some of these challenges that we know fish farms are facing.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Convener.
Thanks, Convener. Continuing on with the framework that we've been talking about extensively this morning. So we've heard concerns from stakeholders that the thresholds are set so high that many farms with serious mortality problems may never actually trigger that intervention. And I'd be interested to understand how confident the Scottish Government is that the threshold in the framework will actually identify sites where action is needed. Because I think the concern is that that threshold is so high that we'll have mortality, but because you've got that threshold, we might actually be seeing farms that have high mortality, but they're not fitting into your threshold that you've identified. So how would those farms still face the scrutiny or intervention?
Helpful just to discuss, I think, a bit of the background as to how this was approached and how we've reached those different definitions. But I'll hand over to Charles, who'll be able to talk through that in a bit more detail.
I mean, that particular issue, the sensitivity of the different parameters within the model and how they vary the output of the model. Actually, the percentile is not the most sensitive. It's actually, of the three parameters, so number of production cycles included, the periodicity of mortality within a production cycle, and the percentile rate above which we consider mortality. The most sensitive variable within the model is actually the number of production cycles that you look at. Second is what the models refer to as streak, so the occurrence of mortality within a production cycle. And the least, or the parameter offering least change is actually the threshold that was set, which might appear counterintuitive. It wasn't exactly what I was expecting to see, but that is the analysis of the model as it's run.
Okay, so if we have farms that have problems that persist across several production cycles, is there a risk that farms with chronically high mortality actually never trigger regulatory action?
I think those which have a high mortality across cycles, if I understand your question correctly, will trigger because it's calling on high mortality. And that will be a product of running the model. But you then need to consider that information as to whether it is real. So then drilling down into available data on what was the cause of that mortality and whether it is a similar cause within the production cycle and whether it is a similar cause between production cycles. And where that cause is common, not only has it been called by the model, but it's been truthed by investigation, that is a meaningful, persistently high mortality site.
Okay. Can you just tell the committee how long a production cycle is?
It will vary by farm, but in the marine environment, it's plus or minus 18 months.
18 months.
There is work by the sector to put larger smolts to sea. I'm sure you're aware of that, which is looking to reduce the length of time that fish spend at sea, recognising the fact that the majority of the hazard is encountered in the marine environment.
Okay, so what we're looking at here then is a concern that is occurring to me here is that if we're looking at a problem that's persisting across several production cycles, and a production cycle is 18 months, and that's just in the marine space, we could potentially be looking at serious welfare issues that continue for years before we actually see any intervention from this government. Many years.
As a previous head of the inspectorate, I would actually disagree with you, because there are inspections on site, and if we have significant welfare concerns, we will flag them to the relevant agency. So, this is one of a number of tools, and bearing in mind that the model was built to produce a result and report at pace specifically for yourselves. This has not necessarily been built as part of the regulatory process. A decision is yet to be made on how that may proceed in the future.
Okay. Just on that point around inspections, so despite millions of fish deaths across the sector, so this is a question around how can the committee actually have confidence in the inspections that underlie looking at these mortalities. So despite millions of fish deaths across the sector, SEPA conducted just 2 unannounced inspections of fish farms in 3 years. APHA has used remote visits rather than in-person attendance at a number of sites. I'd be interested to hear from the Cabinet Secretary what the justification is for that level of oversight, given the scale of mortality that we've been made aware of and the non-compliance trends identified by both of the regulators.
I think there's a few points I would want to pick up there, because I feel like there's an impression being put across that there's significant non-compliance, that nothing's been done in the background while this model was being developed, which couldn't be further from the truth or relate to what actually happens on the ground and the work that's actually undertaken by these agencies as well. I'll hand over to Charles in a minute, who can talk a bit more about the FHI and the work that they would be undertaking as part of their inspections and visits, but I believe there's around 250 inspections that are undertaken each year by them.
Again, that's in person or desk-based?
Again, I'll hand over to Charles, who'll be able to give more information about that too. But again, when there are any significant events, that has to be reported, particularly if they're over a certain threshold. The FHI would then be going to look at that. Again, they can report any welfare concerns if there are any welfare concerns highlighted as a result of that. Again, on the animal welfare element of that, I'd responded to the committee that we'd be looking at bringing forward guidance under the Animal Health and Welfare Act, but we've been working with APHA to look at also increasing the number of on-site inspections, increasing that, I think, by 10%, increasing the inspections to the marine sites as well as looking at additional training for vets in relation to that too. So there's that work going underway there, but I'll hand over to Charles, who'll be able to say a bit more about the work that the FHI would do, because I think it's really important to highlight some of that. Just
before Charles comes in, the 2 weeks ago when we had the regulating bodies in, and even in the work that we were doing for our original report that's brought this session about, I think one of the things that really struck the committee, certainly me, was that this whole mortality piece, there doesn't seem to be a place where there is a body that is totally responsible or catches the mortality issue. It seems that the mortality piece is falling through the cracks. And it also seems to me that the HPA process, which was described at length 2 weeks ago, is quite slow in actually getting on site. Can you speak to that?
Yes, absolutely. But I think I wouldn't say mortality has fallen through the cracks at all. Everybody just has a different regulatory role. So it's about how bodies work together. As I've talked about, FHI could be going out on inspections. They could see a welfare issue, but they're not responsible for animal welfare. That falls to APHA. So it's important that those are referred to the relevant body who's responsible for that area, whereas FHI are, of course, responsible for fish health and disease surveillance as well. So I think it's important to remember the defined regulatory roles that each of these bodies has, and that's why it's undertaken in that way. But again, there is a lot of information about mortality published. It's published for different purposes and for these regulatory purposes, but again, there is nothing falling through the cracks here. And as I've highlighted already, FHI are able to inspect further records at site in detail as well if they had any significant concerns. But again, Charles could provide more information on the work of the FHI.
Okay, I mean, the Fish Health Inspectorate's primary role is the prevention and control of listed disease. So we carry out, the Fish Health Inspectorate carry out a programme of risk-based surveillance. So there's a risk-based programme, and as the Cabinet Secretary alluded to, completes around 250 inspections every year. And those inspections will include consideration of mortality records, movement records, a physical examination of the stock to see whether there is any evidence of the presence of listed disease. But also as a part of the work of Fish Health Inspectorate, we need to consider mortality which is occurring between inspections. So there's a requirement for fish farms to report beyond threshold to the Inspectorate. And they will also follow up where they wish to rule out the presence of listed disease as a cause of that mortality. And a third part of inspection is the legal requirement on farmers to report any reasonable grounds to suspect the presence of a listed disease on site. So they're the three big prongs with regard to inspection.
Can I come in the unannounced inspection point? So I think SEPA's regime was mentioned and AFA and FHI. So unannounced inspections are a really useful tool, but they're almost like the last buck as well, because all of these organisations have risk-based surveillance regimes, and that will inform who they're going to see next. And if there's lots of problems being picked up there, you might want to start looking at increasing the percentage that you do unannounced inspections. And I think sometimes there's a fear that, you know, fish farmers are hiding something, but if there are, so for example, seabed non-compliance, or if there's poor doing fish, if you go to visit that site, you can't hide like a poor doing population. It'll be very obvious. And again, if SEPA's taking samples, the seabed's been there for a long time. So I think they're good an additional tool, but I wouldn't take lower numbers or a 10% as being a bad thing, because you need to consider the inspection regime in the round.
Okay. I mean, that's interesting, because the committee had a site visit to a farm the year before last, and and then just in terms of hiding things, the committee had a visit, and that was interesting. But then afterwards, there was video footage that revealed that things were hidden. So you know, it is concerning.
That was the view of the committee. I think that may be a personal view. That's certainly not what the committee reported on.
I found it very shocking to discover
I think you
that.
need to make it clear that's your personal opinion.
Thank you.
Emma Roddick. You have supplementary on this?
No, not at the moment, thanks.
No. Alistair Allen.
Again, some of these things have been touched on, so I won't labour this point, but the government committed to introducing statutory guidance under the Animal Health and Welfare Scotland Act 2006 Can I ask what progress there is on that, what the timetable is and who's involved?
Yes, I was providing updates to the committee, my last update in September, and we had been considering options as the best way to proceed and move forward. So we have determined that providing official guidance under the Animal Health and Welfare Act 2006 would be how we would proceed. Again, we're at the stage of we'd be engaging with stakeholders to discuss how to take that forward. As I outlined in my opening remarks, that would be we'd be looking to engage with a wide range of stakeholders with an interest in that. So from producers, fish vets, as well as animal welfare organisations too. And I think we're looking to that to be the focus of work in the year ahead and developing that guidance, because I do think it's really important that we get that guidance right and we have that detailed consideration with stakeholders too.
Thank you, Convener.
Rhoda Grant.
Just on the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission report, are there any other measures you're taking on the back of that? And last week we received some evidence with regard to cleaner fish and discussion taking place about technologies and innovation moving forward that might phase out the need for cleaner fish. So I wondered how that fits into the measures you're taking to deal with their welfare.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, we welcome the report that was published by the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission. And as I've already touched on today, we know there's more information, I think, and data and transparency around that. And we'll be looking to engage with Salmon Scotland in terms of some of the recent commitments that they've made to committee. I think in the report that the Welfare Commission had published, obviously, there were quite a lot of recommendations in there, which I think largely related to a lot of research that they felt needed to be done. They also talked about welfare assessment protocols for cleaner fish, research on treatments for disease, as well as a variety of other recommendations. So we obviously had received that towards the tail end of next year. We're given that active consideration as to how we can progress some of those recommendations. But I think the guidance that I've touched on, that we'd be looking to publish, the official guidance under the 2006 Act, that would also be covering cleaner fish as part of that as well. So again, looking at cleaner fish, the wider guidance, that will be a focus of work in the year ahead.
Do you foresee the phasing out of the use of cleaner fish?
I don't think every operator at the moment, not all of them necessarily use cleaner fish. And I think that, it's certainly not, I think that's where the Animal Welfare Commission would like to see things going, that being phased out. But again, they didn't necessarily recommend a change in practice in the use of cleaner fish at the moment, I think because of the benefits for fish health and salmon farming as well. So I think the work that we're taking forward in relation to the Welfare Commission's recommendations, I think would help inform any next steps or any further work that we'd look to do in that regard.
Okay. To move on
That's
to
your questions, the next section. We're now moving on to science and innovation.
Yeah. So the committee recommended some more targeted research into the conditions of micro-jellyfish, the different events that caused mass mortality. And I wonder what research has been commissioned. Has that begun? Has it been put out? And what are the timescales, not only for research to kind of current issues, but also given climate change issues that might arise again in the future?
Well, there's an awful lot of work that's been going on in relation to that, because I think the committee's initial recommendation had talked about the Scottish Government almost commissioning or holding a specific research project. However, we see our role as more about providing that strategic direction and enabling that collaboration to take place in that space as well. So to that end, there is a wide range of research that's underway. We do a lot of work with MASS, which is the Marine Alliance for Science and Technology in Scotland. There's been the work that's been undertaken through the Farm Fish Health Framework and as well as the Sustainable Aquaculture Innovation Centre. I would say in relation to the centre itself, that's been The Scottish Funding Council funding for that was coming to an end. There was £1.5 million made available for the transition to new arrangements, and we hope to be in a position over the coming weeks actually to announce what that new vehicle is going to look like and some of the work that that's going to engage in. But I don't know, and there's also been an awful lot of work and partnerships that we're involved in relation to the climate challenges that you've mentioned. So we work with the Marine Climate Change Impact Partnerships, and that's been about improving the understanding the impacts of climate on aquaculture, and a number of pieces of work there. So I don't know, Jill or Hazel, if there's more that you want to specifically focus on in relation to this one, or projects that you can highlight.
The sheer range, just to underline that, is the main thing. Some of the pieces of work we've done this year in order to bring that sort of coordination around all of that, to ensure that we can understand where the gaps are, we in the broadest possible sense, with a view to supporting academic research into those spaces, has been really interesting. And that there was a specific workshop held on that between Masters and SAIC in, I think it was November, on that in particular, to think about that one in a bit more detail. So I just highlight that as an additional point on that.
And do you encourage industry to share research? Because obviously different companies are looking at, you know, those pressures and how they deal with them. Do industry share that research to make sure that they all learn?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's specific pieces of work that we engage in, or there is also innovation that we fund. Well, you look at specific projects that we funded through the likes of Marine Fund Scotland, as an example. So there's been specific areas there, but that's more for industry bids. But again, ultimately, this is about identifying, you know, with industry what some of the challenges are, what we ultimately need to try and address. Some of that was also highlighted in the key areas of focus within the areas of research interest paper that was published on the back of our science and innovation strategy as well from the Marine Directorate, which shows the key areas and the key questions that we need to try and address in the years ahead, which is then the kind of background to the wider collaboration and the specific projects that are taken forward, and they're done within that framework.
There's a number of ways in which we encourage that industry collaboration around problems that affect everybody, and SAIC's way of working is explicitly around that, where industry is involved in identifying the issues that need solving, not alone, but a part of that conversation, obviously, because they have that intelligence. And in SAIC in particular, and in MFS as well, if there's public money going into a project, by definition, that project will then be shared widely. There's an awful lot of partnership working around those shared problems from industry, from the supply chain, and from academia as well. So it's quite a complicated picture, as I think you're hearing, but that's because there's so much happening and so much detail going on out there as well.
Okay, thank you.
Just on that, you know, the committee did request a government-led research programme, particularly on environmental modelling. And the Fish Health Inspector referenced that the Scottish Government's an area of research interest, which is intended to coordinate research on issues like animal health, jellyfish, algal blooms or whatever. So in your last response to the committee, it only referred to industry-level monitoring, but it didn't refer to government-coordinated research initiatives. So given the response we just heard from Hazel, why isn't there, given the value of this industry to the Scottish economy, over £1 billion, why isn't there an effort to look at what government can do to build consumer confidence, address the issues that are coming down the road in a government-coordinated initiative?
I think we're facilitating that collaboration, and again, that's what the Sustainable Aquaculture Innovation Centre is, and the investment that we've been looking at there to try and fund. Because, again, this is a very collaborative space. We work with a number of different organisations, so it's about how we provide the overall framework through the areas of research about, well, what are the key questions we need to try and answer, and who are the partners that are best placed to help us deliver and collaborate on that research too, which I think is what we've been alluding to in our previous responses.
Okay, thank you. Emma Harper.
I think Rhoda Grant has touched on it, and you mentioned it earlier about innovation in vaccines and treatments and other things. And I'm thinking about, in previous committee evidence sessions, I was asking about collaboration in terms of research and development with Canada, for instance, because they have salmon farming industry as well. So is that's something that we obviously need to continue to support and engage with, and use Scottish Government funding to look at collaborative working with other salmon farming countries?
Well, I would say more broadly, in terms of our science and innovation strategy, I think recognising that international collaboration is a really important part of that. And again, while I outlined in previous responses, we're not necessarily comparing like with like when it comes to other salmon producing nations. There are some similar changes there that we can look to try and address, with changing sea temperatures, different climatic conditions as well. So I do think that's an important element to work to. Sorry, Jill.
Yeah, I can just add to that there is a significant level of collaborative engagement going on across the jurisdictions. So we particularly work with Norway on sea lice and sea lice monitoring and developing sea lice standards. There's gill disease groups. The innovation centres speak to each other because whilst the context is different, the environment is different, some of the challenges are shared. So we're very much trying to work together to tackle the big issues.
That was pretty much it. Thanks.
Beatrice Wishart.
We've already touched on the sort of collaborative space and the interaction between government, industry, academia, regulators. So in understanding what progress has been made on establishing a kind of dedicated space, we recommended research pens in the report. So what role would government expect industry to play in funding and governance?
Again, I think that's an idea that we've been interested to tease out and to see what that might look like. But I think what we were keen to do first, though, is make sure that we had the latest iteration of the Sustainable Aquaculture Innovation Centre in place first, because they would be best to lead in looking at that work, engaging with the sector to see what expectations were, or how we could potentially look to move that forward. So I think we've been focused on establishing that new body, getting that up and running, and again, hopefully be able to be in a position in a couple of weeks' time to provide more of an update and announcements in relation to that. But we think that that would be the best vehicle to take that forward. So we've just been waiting on that. But I don't know if there's anything further.
There is a conversation, it is kind of early stage conversation running around innovation sites in more detail, because there's a lot of interest in this in the sector, and not just in salmon farming either, but we have similar interests from shellfish, seaweed and others as well, and across UK as well. So there's a conversation taking place. It hasn't reached a point of conclusion yet. That doesn't indicate a lack of commitment to that. It's just the phasing and the need to get it right for the various sectors interested.
Thank you.
I'm going to suspend the meeting for 5 minutes for a comfort break. Suspend the meeting. We'll continue with our questions on aquaculture inquiry. Questions from Tim Eagle.
So, my understanding is that several key recommendations on sea lice escapes, wild salmon interactions are being delayed because of ongoing legal proceedings, and so the timetables aren't going forward. FMS have raised concerns that the absence of environmental management plans and contingency measures during ongoing legal proceedings creates a regulatory gap. How do you respond to that concern?
I heard the evidence from Fisheries Management Scotland a couple of weeks ago, and just to outline that, of course, SEPA is the lead regulator for sea lice and interactions with wild fish, and they're now responsible for providing local authorities with advice as a statutory consultee to the planning system. You're absolutely right in terms of the implementation of the sea lice risk assessment framework. That was a key focus of work for the past few years, actually, to get that implemented. But there have been a number of appeals to that process, which we're waiting to be determined before we can then move forward. But I mean, that's standard with any process, and I think it's right that there is that right of appeal. But I believe that it's been communicated that I think the first communication on that process is due to be published in April, which will be focusing on the policy and the legal elements of that. Okay. So obviously I'm limited in terms of what I can say in terms of the overall framework, I think, because it's subject to these proceedings at the moment. But that has been a key focus of work, and of course something that we're
And in terms of environmental harm, is there any other interim measures you're putting in place while all that's going on in the background?
Do you mean in relation to sea lice specifically? Because I think we're talking about there's
I guess
work in terms of
all of that, but sea lice or within the wider points around escapes, wild salmon interactions, etc.
Yeah, there's quite a lot ongoing there. So I'd set out in my previous response to committee, we were trying to prioritise that work in terms of when it would be taken forward. So I think in relation to escapes in particular, that had been identified as a priority that we would work on this year. However, we did actually start that work earlier when we'd actually had some resource become available at an earlier point. So some of that initial engagement had started, and we are looking to progress with the escapes work over the course of this year and looking at the penalties. But of course, I think there's been some collaboration between Fisheries Management Scotland, also with the sector. I'd be keen for that to continue in the hope that we can move that work forward. Then there's the technical standard, which we had prioritised for work going into next year. Sorry, Jill, I think there's more you want to add.
I can come in on EMPs, I think you're asking about. So, just to be, I think from the start, to think back to what Alan Wells said at committee that you raised. So, the position relating to EMPs is that we're no longer advising new EMPs for new fish farms. And that is because they were introduced as an interim measure. They're for monitoring and reporting back to help support a future adaptive approach, which is SEPA's framework. So as the Cabinet says, SEPA is determining new licences along with that approach. There's no new EMPs, but SEPA has also commenced a monitoring programme. So this is the second year of the monitoring programme. So we don't want duplication and regulation. Duplication and regulation. So we're implementing the policy as stands. There are appeals processes going on in relation to variation of licences, but that relates to lice limits, and the monitoring sort of sits out with that. And we had planned to transition away from existing EMPs, where they exist, because they're not everywhere, into SEPA's national monitoring programme, but that has been delayed, and we're building into that next year.
Okay.
But there's, I hope that answers the question.
That's fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Ariane Burgess.
I think it's kind of been touched on, but I just want to get clarity here. So if the regulatory framework's been suspended, what is actually protecting wild salmon in the meantime?
As just outlined, there's the monitoring which is still taking place through the EMP process for those existing sites, because as outlined they were meant to be an interim measure while the new sea lice framework was implemented, and SEPA is undertaking the monitoring at the new sites as well. But of course our key focus had been on delivering the sea lice framework as is, so of course that can't be implemented while it's under appeal. But again, that is what has been the key focus for us. But I think if there were any issues raised or highlighted during this period, then we'd look to try and address that. But again, that's the current process as it stands at the moment.
Thank you. My question's around the enhanced seabed monitoring. You know, we heard that, I think it was described as eDNA testing, which will help improve the quality standards for planned investigations or whatever, and those will kick in from now over the next decade. The information on seabed monitoring and environmental quality is really important to stakeholders. But how can communities and stakeholders access this data, which would again lead to more transparency and potentially a better understanding by stakeholders who can then be in a better place to scrutinise whether there is improvements over these sites? How are we going to see that roll out?
Well, I think, first of all, it's the digital platform for that, and the environmental performance assessment scheme is going to, I think they're looking to have that up and running next year, which would, I think, pull all that information together. But what I would say is that, in the meantime, the information on the environmental monitoring surveys is still published on Scotland's aquaculture website. And what that information outlines is the monitoring method, survey type and the classification as a result of that. But I think the new system that they're looking to implement would have more comprehensive information around that.
Thank you. That's helpful. Now going to move on to no, actually, I've got a further question before we move on to spatial planning. Sorry, I'm jumping all over the place here. Beg your pardon. Emma Roddick had a question. I jumped. My apologies, Emma.
As convener, so I wanted to ask about Fisheries Management Scotland comments in the last session that work on progressing the Salmon Interactions Working Group recommendations is stalled because staff had moved on. So what is being done to ensure that momentum's not lost as a result of that?
Well, I think that specific piece of work is the bit of work that I touched on in relation to escapes. Again, that had been our priority for the coming year. We didn't expect to have resource available earlier last year, which is why that work had commenced. So we'd started it earlier than we had planned as soon as that resource became available. However, we don't have that resource in place at the moment, but it is going to be a priority for the coming year, as I'd set out in my initial response to committee. And then the focus will be on the technical standard. We discussed that prioritisation with stakeholders as well, because we know how important these pieces of work are. But again, I think it's the wider collaborative piece on escapes that is important too, and I'd be hoping that the sector, Fisheries Management Scotland as well, are engaging in that, are continuing to have those discussions so that we can really look to progress and drive forward that work.
I do understand why it would need to be collaborative with the industry, but I was quite concerned at the responses in the last session around escapes. A couple of quite large escapes had been discussed in a bit of detail, and the regulators were taking questions around whether there were particular changes that were needed, systemic issues, and how that related to potential interaction with wild salmon. It did seem to be that they were relying on industry monitoring and industry opinion on what needed to happen next. And I just wonder, is that enough? And when you've got so many regulators involved in a particular policy area, shouldn't one of them be taking the lead rather than the industry on checking whether there has been interaction and what the industry should then do to prevent it?
Yeah, I think there's a few points in relation to that. Again, escapes have to be reported, and then it would be the FHI who would investigate that, look at any containment measures, and if there would be any action that was needed to be taken as a result of that, because obviously we don't want there to be any escapes. I know that some of the incidents were touched on last time, and I think there had been work that had been committed to. I think one of the significant incidents was touched on with Maui, and they then funded work after that to look at the wider impacts. But again, we want to make sure that we are addressing that, first of all, looking at the penalties so that we can utilise any funding for that for the benefit of wild salmon conservation, as well as then, as I say, after that piece of work is completed, looking at the technical standard. But we're also conscious that things can change quite quickly and adapt, and I think that will feed into that broader bit of work, is how we can make sure that will be we're building a technical standard that can be adapted for the future. But Jill, the moment
We think it's really, really important to be monitoring what's going on at a national level in relation to integration. So we've had our first integration report in 2021 and the scientists are working in the second one. And then we're having a think about how we might fund and deliver the next one, because it gives you a kind of time snap over time. You need to see what's happening in the individual rivers, and we can start to build up the evidence base behind that, in addition to following up on the escapes incidents themselves and trying to manage that as low as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be really good to see progress made on that. I suppose the other point that was raised by Fisheries Management Scotland in that session was that there is an apparent gap in reporting even around escapes. There was a reference to a wellboat escape that wasn't captured in the aquaculture database, so it does seem that there are still potential interactions that maybe aren't being monitored, or fisheries boards aren't aware of, even because there's just that gap.
I think just to say on that, I think that specific instance as well, it was actually reported. It was just the publishing of that information which was the problem that highlighted to us. So I think I just want to reassure the committee that was an issue that we'd picked up. It was about the publishing of that information. It had been reported to us. But again, we know how to prevent that happening in future and what to look out for. I mean, I would say that those kind of escapes are very rare. But again, we know what the problem was there, and we'll be able to fix that for the future so that that doesn't happen again and that is transparent.
Do we know the extent of any environmental and interactions impacts?
In relation to that specific incident, I'd have to ask you if there's more information.
No, the fish were small. They were smolts, I believe. And the risk is relatively low from that sort of escape event because they don't often return to rivers. But that's why we're doing a sort of national integration. Well, it's very difficult, even though there's some sectors where it's sometimes very difficult to tie exactly back to a single escape event, unless you've got the sort of area. But this took place in a harbour, I think. So I think the national picture is probably more important to see what's happening in rivers over time, whilst making sure escapes like that don't happen.
Okay. It was just, some of this has been touched on, but the committee made a recommendation that there was an immediate end to the sighting of farms in the close vicinity of known migratory routes for wild salmon. And of course, there's a massive ongoing discussion, isn't there, around the interactions between salmon farming and wild salmon, and what that means for some of our very iconic rivers across Scotland, actually, and that sort of industry around wild salmon. So I guess what I'm just asking is there an update? Like, where are you on that recommendation? But also more broadly, is there any significant ongoing work about new migratory routes, what's happening with the wild salmon, what those interactions are, and how is that going to move forward? Because I think that's pretty important for us.
Absolutely, and I think there's a number of pieces of work I can touch on there. I might bring Jill in a moment, though, for some more of that detail. I think, well, first of all, we've touched a bit on the sea lice risk assessment framework. Yep. Ultimately, well, that new framework, which we're waiting on the outcomes of the appeals before we can fully implement, but that's more for existing developments. It's working for new developments right now, and it's about guiding them to the right places, yep, or for more suitable conditions in the first place. So, again, we have that action. I recognise the previous committees and that inquiry's recommendations, and again the reiterated call from the committee and the recommendations. Of course, there's a number of factors that are taken into consideration when businesses are establishing sites, but I think part of that is work that we're wanting to explore through our consenting task group. So that's been focused so far on the pre-application phase, and there have been a number of pilot projects working their way through that. But I think having that discussion with businesses to see about that, whether there's potential to relocate, because I think even if a farm wants to relocate or move, they're still subject to all the same regulatory processes. So again, it's starting to look at, well, can we consider some of those projects and have that engagement through the consenting work that we're doing, so that we can deal with that in an effective way.
Okay. And just on that wider point about what's going on in the background at the moment, is there, not, I guess it directly related to this, obviously there's a lot of private work going on in terms of trying to restore salmon populations in rivers, and I don't want to get too distracted by that because we're talking about salmon farming, but I think it's relevant, isn't it, because people bring that into the conversation of salmon farming. Is there wider work going on to look at the interactions?
Well, I think there's broader work going on as a whole in relation to wild salmon. So the key focus for the work, we'd obviously had the key priority areas we were focusing on from the Salmons Interaction Working Group. That had been about establishing the sea lice risk assessment framework, as well as focusing on penalties, escapes and technical technical standard that we're taking forward. In relation to wild salmon, though, the key focus has been the implementation of the strategy that we published. We published the Strategy 22, Implementation Plan 2023, focusing on that's across the broad range of pressures that we know are impacting wild salmon populations. There's been an awful lot of work that's been getting developed there. I'd be happy to write to the committee if that would be helpful with more information about some of the specifics of that work. There have also been projects, whether that's through the Marine Fund Scotland, the Nature Restoration Fund, Water Environment Fund as well, all that have been looking at, again, addressing some of the challenges we know that are facing wild salmon.
Just come back to the SEPA sea lice framework. So, as Cabinet Secretary says, that's designing to guide farms away from sensitive locations. Beneath that, there's a monitoring programme that started, but there's an underpinning monitoring and research programme. It's a really complicated risk to manage, and that's why we've got the modelling and the sea lice framework, and there's lots of inputs into that, and one of them is the migratory routes. So there are collaborative projects. There's one led by AST, which Scottish Government has contributed to, Salmon Scotland has contributed to that, to help us understand whether the tracks that we've got for fish are right. And there's collaboration, so our scientists input into the State of Knowledge papers at NASCO, and then I've mentioned the national integration reports that we've got as well. So we do need it's the monitoring behind, monitoring evidence behind the policy decisions to feed in.
Okay. Convener, is there any chance I could ask my earlier question quickly? It might fit into that, or do you want to leave that to the end?
I can guess what your question is. I think it might be more appropriate after the next section, if you don't mind.
Yes,
I'm very aware that we have a gallery that has many stakeholders that are particularly interested in the interaction between farmed and Scotland's wild salmon population. It's something that's been raised continually over the last 8 years since the initial report. And we've heard there's been progress in sea lice transfer. We're looking at issues in disease transmission and the wider ecological impact that aquaculture might have on wild stocks. In your response, you've outlined some general areas of progress, but we continually hear from stakeholders that the risk to wild salmon remains largely unchanged in practice on the ground. So, given these concerns, can you give us any evidence that there has been a meaningful reduction in the impact on farmed to wild salmon? Where that evidence is, if it doesn't exist, why is it after a decade almost of these concerns being raised that we're still not seeing measurable improvements in safeguarding wild salmon?
I think there's a number of points in that as well. I think, again, a significant step in what has been a really significant piece of work in development is the sea lice risk assessment framework that we look to implement. So, as I've said, as Gill's already outlined as well, that's been about guiding developments to the right place initially, and of course we need to wait on the outcome of the appeals, but again that's a risk-based adaptive framework that we hope will be able to address some of those risks that have been identified. But I can't underestimate that's been a key focus of work going forward. It's involved a lot of intensive engagement both with the sector, with wild fisheries interests, because ultimately we want to be able to address and deal with those overall issues. Again, that's been the key work, as well as then looking to, as I set out in the prioritisation, the work that we've been taking forward on a new technical standard for finfish, as well as dealing with penalties for escapes as well. So it's about taking action on all of these fronts. But I don't know if there's more you want to add, Jill.
No, I think SEPA sea lice risk assessment framework is really a significant step forward into a science and evidence-led management tool. And whilst I know some concerns are being raised about the appeals and the limits not applying until they're determined, the framework is absolutely being applied to new farms. I think SEPA's only processed one new farm that's had to accept the conditions to proceed. So the framework applies to existing and new farms, and we'll of course work through the appeals process as quickly as we can. In addition to that, there's the new monitoring that we've brought in. Escapes generally the average has come down over time, but they're still maybe a bit too high, and we want to take forward that work in the technical standard and the penalties and have a look at greater look at what is happening and why the escapes are happening and sharing of information between that. And this is always a really challenging area to talk about, because we always talk about managing risk, and risk doesn't always equate into impact, and it's always quite complicated. But we're making really good progress on sea lice, and hopefully through further integration assessments we can take that next step in escapes as well.
So I suppose, Cabinet said, do you believe that the framework we've got is finally robust enough to protect wild salmon stocks?
Again, it's been subject to development over years to ensure that it addresses the risks and the challenges, and that it can adapt over time. Again, that's the model that is being appealed at the moment. But again, that has been a significant undertaking, and we hope that can be implemented. But that's been, the real focus of work on tackling the interactions between sea lice and wild fish.
But you believe that framework's now robust enough to protect wild salmon?
Again, I will need to wait on the outcome of the appeals. We'd work together with SEPA, with industry, with Fisheries Management Scotland as well, to again develop a framework that we believed would address the interactions there. So again, we still are looking to implement that, but of course we've got to wait on the outcome of the appeals and whatever recommendations may arise as a result of that.
Okay, thank you. Ariane Burgess.
Convener, just following up on both the convener's questions and Tameagle's questions about the migratory routes, but we seem to be leaning in quite heavily to the sea lice risk assessment framework, which is kind of on pause. In the meantime, other jurisdictions who are facing similar concerns about wild salmon are beginning to take a precautionary approach. So, for example, in British Columbia, the Canadian government's removing open net salmon farms from key wild salmon migration routes. And in Washington State, marine salmon farming is being phased out following concerns about escapes and impacts on wild fish. So I'd be interested to hear if the Scottish Government has undertaken any comparable assessment of salmon farm locations. And I recognise that maybe the Government is leaning into this assessment framework, which is on pause, but an assessment, perhaps we need to move to another approach, which is to take an assessment of salmon farm locations in relation to wild salmon migration routes in Scotland and actually take some rapid action, given that we heard from Alan Wells 2 weeks ago that wild salmon are in crisis and they are now on the endangered species list.
Again, I think that the key focus for us, we have talked at length in just the previous responses about the sea lice risk assessment framework, and make sure, first of all, we're guiding development to the right places, which that has been doing, notwithstanding the appeals that are ongoing for the existing sites as well. As I touched on in my response to Tim Eagle too, again, if farms want to move and are considering that, they're still to go through all that, the regulatory consenting process. And again, that's work we're considering through that framework too. But there's also the more broader presumption against development in relation to the North East. We don't have that permitted there. That's set out in our national planning framework and measures there too. So again, I'd say that there's a number of pieces. It's not just as straightforward as looking at a site, dictating it should move. There are a number of considerations that need to be taken into account, not least environmental conditions, considering the wider impact and the wider regulation that's needed to get all of that in place. So what I'm talking about just now is we recognise that people will want to do that, and that's what we are trying to help make happen.
But do you acknowledge that Scotland has a responsibility? It's kind of an international context. The salmon move internationally, and it's, from what we've been hearing and all of the recommendations we made over a year ago, I'm not really hearing the progress that's being made. And meanwhile, other countries, other jurisdictions are actually taking really strong, robust, proactive action in response to wild salmon being in crisis.
Again, I don't think that's necessarily a fair assessment. We had been developing all that work, and again, through the processes that we have set out, that and looking to implement that new framework, that's been appealed, as they are perfectly entitled to do it, and we're waiting the outcome of that process. But again, there's action being taken on a number of fronts. The consenting task work, that has been really important, first of all, for looking to streamline and deal with those cases in a more effective way between the different regulatory bodies, but again is also going to be really important for some of the work that we're talking about here. I don't think it's fair to say that there hasn't been any progress. That progress we've had to prioritise what work we're taking forward. These have been significant pieces of work that have been a massive undertaking to do, not least with all the engagement that we need to do throughout that process too, and a number of considerations that need to be factored in. So again, I would say that there has been progress. I appreciate it will never be as fast as what people would like, but that doesn't mean that we're also not taking action across the number of other pressures that we know are facing wild salmon, as identified in our wild salmon strategy too.
Move on to questions from Rhoda Grant.
The committee had asked for a strategic spatial planning to be put in place to guide where salmon farming should be consented and maybe where it is not appropriate. But we know there's a delay in the National Marine Plan 2 coming forward, and as you said in your opening statement, you know, our regional plans are kind of appearing on an ad hoc basis. So I wonder what you are doing to ensure that decisions are being made properly, I guess, within a national strategic context and also within a regional context to make sure that they're not being cited in the wrong places.
Yeah, there's obviously you've touched on, I think, the development of the new National Marine Plan. So the next phase of that had been delayed just because we've been considering the outcome of the consultation on the planning position statement. And I think we've been looking at, through that National Marine Planning process, the question has been raised about a spatial planning element to that, and I know that that's been given consideration for the next iteration of work. So again, that's been a really significant piece of work. There was a lot that came out of that consultation, which is what is being considered at the moment. But of course, even notwithstanding the National Marine Plan 2 and the development of that, and the further consultation is slightly delayed, we're still operating within the wider planning system it exists at the moment with the National Marine Plan, and also I'd highlighted in my response, my opening remarks, as you've highlighted, the Orkney and Shetland plans have since been adopted and since I last appeared at committee, and I think there's work that's still going on in relation to the Clyde. But it makes sense for us to look at further developing regional marine plans at the point we have a new National Marine Plan 2 in place, rather than looking to further that during this interim period. But even in the absence, or for those areas that don't have a regional marine plan, there's still the local development plans. And I think the regional marine plans that are placed in Shetland and Orkney, I think that they have those spatial considerations as part of them too. So I think I just want to emphasise that spatial element and that consideration is something that is very much being factored into future development of National Marine Plan 2, which of course is going to be subject to further consultation anyway.
Sorry, I may have picked you up wrong, but are you saying that there'll be no further regional plans produced until the national plan?
Again, there's been work ongoing in relation to the Clyde. It's my colleague Gillian Martin who's been leading on the marine planning process. But I think that has been what's been set out. I think we need to wait until we have a new National Marine Plan in place before looking to the further development of regional marine plans in this interim period, given that the new plan is looking to be adopted, I think, within the next couple of years. But again, it's been Shetland, Orkney and the Clyde area that have really been at the forefront in developing the regional marine planning work.
So given that, you know, we're looking and some people are talking about moving fish farms further offshore, and I think last week put through the statutory instrument about kind of management of that. Without the marine plans, and given we've got renewables, we've got so much pressure on the marine environment, and we as a committee often hear from the fishing community that sometimes their needs are being overlooked with all of this going on. I mean, when can we expect this to happen? Because people are crying out for it.
Again, I wouldn't want to come across that there's almost an absence of any sort of framework and development for these developments at the moment, because that is very much in place, and that's what we've been clarifying over the course of the past year. So I am looking at offshore development as an example. We've clarified that local authorities are responsible in that 3 to 12 mile nautical mile zone, that SEPA would be the lead regulator in that space, as well as removing any potential duplication with the marine licence. So we've been trying to clarify what that element looks like. We don't need a regional marine plan to be in place for that development to be determined, because local authorities have the planning powers to be able to look at that anyway, and they'd be doing that in accordance with their own local development plans. We also have the overarching National Planning Framework 4, as well as the overarching National Marine Plan. And the National Marine Plan is in place until such time as a new National Marine Plan would be brought forward. So again, any developments coming forward at the moment would still be considered within that wider planning framework as it exists at the moment. It doesn't need that regional marine plan focus to happen. But again, where those areas want to take forward regional marine plans, and again, as I said, Shetland, Orkney and the Clyde have been at the forefront of that and in developing their own.
You talked earlier about moving fish farms. You know, if there was an issue, they could move, but you also said they would need to be consented as normal, and we know that takes a long time. And I just wonder, without, you know, a plan to guide this, we're not going to get that movement happening. They're just going to have to close rather than move away from threats.
Again, you wouldn't need a regional marine plan to be in place to enable that to happen. I think what I was talking about, though,
but to happen quickly, I mean, the delay in getting all those consents in place, the threat is gone by the time you would do that.
But that's what the consenting task group work is hoping to do. So again, there's been, through the pilots that have been taken forward, there have been a number of projects that have worked through that consenting work at the moment. And again, we need to have that discussion to see how can we streamline that process and have that engagement with industry to assist in that, and how we can use the mechanism of the consenting work that we're taking forward, I think, to look to do that. Jill.
I could just... so just to provide reassurance, consenting decisions just now are all think very carefully about the site's location, its design, whether it meets environmental regulations. There's community consultation embedded throughout that process, and we've got ultimate democracy with local authorities being in control of that. I think when Ben Hadfield was here, he was supporting more upfront information on where sensitive species are and the layering of management maps, which was something that we committed to do beyond National Marine Plan 2. There is more to do in this space, and it almost builds on the work of the consenting task group, which is in around what's in the area, what local knowledge do we have. To have that additional tool could be quite helpful for developers so that they can easily see risks and constraints. So it's progress as well. Work in progress, sorry.
Work in progress.
Thank you. Emma Roddick. Thank you.
Wiener, one of the biggest concerns that's raised with us around the placement of farms is that interaction with wild salmon, or potential interaction with wild salmon. And I do note that the Nature Conservation Act places a duty on every public body and office holder in exercising any functions to further conservation of biodiversity. Dr Wells had raised concerns about lack of any proper oversight of salmon farm proposals in terms of their potential impact on wild stocks, and environmental management plans are no longer imposed on consented farms, and SEPA's national monitoring framework is not yet operational. So in light of all of that, and particularly the 2004 duty, do we know enough about interactions with wild salmon? Are we taking enough action when it comes to placement of salmon farms, and are we doing enough to mitigate those potential impacts?
Again, I think that's what the processes that we have in place are ultimately about. And again, I just come back to the work that we'd be looking at in the sea lice risk assessment framework as well. That's also about making sure that we're guiding development to the right places. And we've touched on the environmental management plans. They're not being imposed on new developments because they were an interim measure, because new developments would be part of the sea lice risk assessment framework. And as Jill has outlined, the new farm that has come forward is part of that new framework now. So again, SEPA would be undertaking the monitoring for that, whereas the existing monitoring would take place under the existing EMPs in the interim period while the appeals are worked out. So again, we have robust regulation in place that is about addressing these issues before determining if any application could even go forward in the first place. And there are a number of considerations that are factored into that.
There has been a lot of discussion, though, around research, counting fish, understanding more about what is impacting on wild stocks. Are we at the point where we can be confident about whether a proposed or new farm is going to have an impact?
Again, I think that there's a number of points that you've touched on there, and I think a number of different investments that we've made, I think, to try and get more of that information. But ultimately, we want to make sure that development is happening in the right places, and we are seeing that trend towards people wanting to move further offshore where there are better environmental conditions, and it's ultimately better for, and they're seeing improvements for fish health and welfare. So for me, it's about, right, how can we try and, touching on what Rhoda Grant was questioning earlier, about how we can help facilitate that process in the consenting regime. It's not about removing any of that process, it's about just making it a bit more streamlined, and that's largely what the consenting work has been dealing with, and ultimately making sure we have that development in the right place in the first place.
I can come in on the sea lice risk assessment framework, but I probably feel I could speak about it more freely than SEPA could. I think, so to the answer, do we know enough? No, not yet. We need to keep investing in research, but the SEPA framework itself has used best available international evidence. So that included taking thresholds and looking at sea lice emissions and establishing which thresholds above you might expect wild salmon to occur. The tool, I know some of the stakeholders are speaking about it on the 25th, the tool is designed to be precautionary in nature, and it's helped to identify those higher risk areas. So that's where the licence variations and the limits came in. And then for any new farms, if they want to go in those areas, they cannot increase the lice load, or they can be guided to somewhere else where it's low risk. So it is managing risk, and it has moved us on.
But if we still don't know enough, should the research piece not come first before new farms?
I think the framework, as I say, it's designed to be precautionary, so it can say in this area with an additional level of precaution we need to do more monitoring because this is where the risk is, but farms over here are okay, they're low risk. So I think it does both, whilst we do have the monitoring and research strategy to sit behind it. So it's that adaptive nature that we always try and put into regulation of, with the monitoring that comes through, if there's something that flags up that means we need to loosen control or tighten it, that's what that adaptive framework should do.
Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Convener. One of the pilot evaluations that has been made was around consenting. So what specific changes have been made as a result of that, and how will you measure success from a community perspective, looking at communities and how they benefit, not just the perspective of applicants?
I think that, well, it's been quite an iterative process, and I think looking to make improvements as it's been developing. We had an evaluation of the consenting work which published last year, and I think it had highlighted that there were some benefits to the approach, but I think there were also 10 recommendations on the back of that about what other improvements could be made. But I'll ask Jill to speak to a bit more of the detail as to some of the changes that have been implemented as a result.
So the pre-application pilots are really trying to put more formal procedure around the pre-application phase and joint multilateral advice, but also having transparency around that. So there's 3 stages. Each stage is published. It feeds into the already statutory consultation purposes, so people should be able to see it, and they should be able to feel the standardisation of process and expectations. We had a specific outcome on community engagement to make sure that those processes are transparent and that community engagement is being undertaken. the evaluation report recommended further guidance around that, and I think there's a couple of interacting things here, because there's expectations on community engagement in the consenting process itself and other users in the seabed. There's the sector's engagement, which will start before that process, before they enter that process, and continue throughout, so they've got their engagement charter. And then there's also our commitment on community benefit best practice principles, which it's not the exact same, but it feeds into the picture in the round of work that we're doing in community benefit.
Convener, the committee recommended clearer good practice principles for community benefit, and I'd be interested to hear what progress has actually been made on that work and when the committee will see a clear proposal for how community benefit from salmon farming will operate in practice.
Yes, fine. I think there's a point, first of all, just in relation to there's been the increase in rents of 1.5% that have been implemented this year. And ultimately that goes to Crown Estate Scotland, and then that goes back to coastal local authorities, which is about that coastal community benefit. But of course that's a bit more general from that perspective. As Jill has touched on as well, we made that commitment to scope out work on a community benefit package. That work has been progressing and just been really looking at a wide range of evidence in relation to that, looking at international comparators, doing our own research, academic papers as well. We are looking to have wider engagement in relation to that. That's still to commence, and then look to deliver some of that new package into next year. So again, there'll be that wider consultation with stakeholders on that.
So did you say we would be seeing, I asked when we would see it, so...
And, I think a delivery next year, and we'd have the rest of that engagement work take place throughout this year.
So 2027.
Yeah.
I'm just interested in that process that you're working on. So when the government talks about community benefit, I'd be interested to understand, is it only looking at jobs and financial contribution, or does it also consider the wider economic impact? So, for example, some in Scotland's hospitality sector are choosing not to serve farmed salmon because they're concerned about the production practices and the reputational implications for Scotland's food brand. So has the Scottish Government assessed whether salmon farming could be creating reputational risks for Brand Scotland and for other parts of Scotland's food and tourism economy?
Again, when we're talking about our community benefit package, I'm talking specifically about the communities that are hosting aquaculture. And that goes from, as I say, the benefits and the funding that flows from Crown Estate Scotland to local authorities for coastal community benefit. It's the wider benefit that we see provision of. As an example, I think I talked about this previously at committee, visiting Colonsay, where Maui had also invested together with our Rural and Islands Housing Fund to build 6 houses there for the local community, which has been quite transformative there. It is about these wider benefits that we would hope and expect to see. But again, we're engaging on that wider work there. But you talk about something, what I hope I've been able to outline today, and we talked a lot about this at the start of the meeting as well, and I really just have to emphasise the robust regulation that is in place for our salmon farms across Scotland, the transparency of the sector as well, and I think more so than any other sector in terms of the volume of information that's published, whether that be about mortality, environmental impact whatsoever. So I think it's really important to get that on the record and recognise that, because it does, of course, the product is our #1 food export, but again, it's on the back of strict environmental conditions and regulation that we have in place.
But do you have an awareness that there are people in the hospitality sector in Scotland who are choosing not to serve farmed salmon because of the concern of the mortalities and all the other things that we've been talking about, the impact on wild salmon, and just their concern that this is having a knock-on effect on Brand Scotland?
Again, I haven't captured that information, so I don't have that or know what the extent of that would be. I'm just trying to counter the point that, again, there shouldn't, because of everything that we've outlined today and the discussions that we've had, I would hope that people would continue to support our Scottish farmed salmon.
Would you be willing to take that on board, that issue on board that's being raised by the hospitality sector, and factor that into the work that you're looking at?
Of course, I'm happy to engage, but again, it's about prioritising what way and what would be the ask of committee in relation to that, because I've set out the list of commitments that we were looking to implement, the prioritisation of that work. So, again, it would only be to detract from, I think, other important pieces of work that we were set to do. But again, if the committee has any specific recommendations that we'd like the government to consider, then, of course, we would consider whatever comes forward. Thanks.
Tim Eagle.
It's a difficult position, isn't it? I think I found this when we discussed the report previously, between recognising what we all want to achieve in terms of rural depopulation and supporting an industry which is very valuable to Scotland, but equally at the same point making sure that it works for communities and the various different sectors. And I guess that's why at the end of that report that we wrote, it sort of had a bit of an urgency about it, an urgency in that sense that actually we do need to do something here. We need to keep this industry, but that means we need to show all of the public that actually we are ensuring that legislation practices are in place that makes it the best it possibly can be, which is the same what we're doing with our wider farm sector. I just want to come back to you because it slightly covers all the themes, but the committee recommended that the Scottish Government provide powers to the Fish Health Inspectorate to limit or halt production at sites which record persistent high mortality rates. So we're coming back slightly. And then in a letter to us, you said, upon completion of so you said you were going to create a robust analytical framework, and then upon completion of the model validation, outputs will be generated and sites screened as potentially exhibiting persistent elevated mortality will be taken forward for ground truthing. I love that word, ground truthing, a bit of ground truthing. I think, if I'm right, that all of this is just related to mortality. That's all you're really looking at there is mortality. In Norway, they've got the traffic light system, which seems so much easier. So they take into consideration wild salmon populations, disease risk, migration routes, environmental factors, and mortality. And then they do a green, red, or amber, and that would mean you might have to halt production, you might have to reduce the amount you've got in pens, you might have to find other ways. And it all changes, and it's very simple. And I think that seems very, when I read into this, and I was doing this over the last few days, that seems very publicly accessible and very probable to put into place in Scotland. So I guess my question is, am I right in that your robust analytical framework is only taking into account mortality? And have you considered adopting a system like they have in Norway, which would make it easier to stop production, move production, etc., moving forward?
I would just say that nothing is ever that straightforward, and I think we can.
Oh, but can it be?
Well, I wish it could be.
I think it can be.
It can't, because, again, I think it's just the same when it comes to international comparisons. We're not comparing like with like. We'll also have different regulatory systems with different responsibilities, and we're dealing and working in completely different environments. But in saying that, of course, I mean, those are the first questions you have. You want to, again, comes back to the wider collaboration piece. We're always looking at what's happening elsewhere, right? Is there a development we could look at where it's not a lift and shift model, but, you know, elements that we can look to learn from or adapt, or what would work in a Scottish context? You're right, the persistent high mortality work is focused on mortality, because that's what we were tasked to look at. And is there a significant issue here that we need to try and address? And that's what the development of that model was about. And again, we have these other mechanisms in place which are about considering all this information in the round. The consenting task work we're taking forward, the sea lice risk assessment framework too. But I don't know if Jill wants to say a bit more, I think, just about that international comparison. And
so the original Norwegian sea lice traffic light system, it is predicated on sea lice and risks to wild salmonids only, and that's what the 6% increase, stay the same 6% decrease, was based on. We always say we shouldn't compare, I'm going to compare, but we actually, because of Scotland's seabed and environment, we do have quite a strict environmental regime on seabed impacts because we need it. We don't have quite as deep fjords, so we are operating in slightly different environments. And I think Norway, for their sea lice traffic light system, is now coming to a similar place where Scotland is. Our frameworks are starting to align more, and they've committed to doing some additional work on looking at fish health and incentivising good environmental performance, but that's new, that's under development. And I guess we are also interested in trying to do that. So we've got SEPA that has 50% reduced carbon licence fees, for example, for waste capture technology. So there's different ways to do that. But yeah, we're in regular dialogue with Norway.
But my understanding was that when the Norway model started, which is I think it was 2017, it was primarily around sea lice and wild salmon, but it has expanded since then to take into account other factors, is my understanding. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I guess what I'm trying to do here is taking into account the importance of both high-quality welfare and product, you know, and also the community view, and actually making sure, because the end, well, I've got it written down somewhere. Paragraph 311 of the report we wrote had this big statement on moratoriums or pauses on production. And that was a massive conversation in this room around the committee. But actually, it was felt that was pushing it too far. And I'm not sure I want to get back to that. But also I know that fundamentally I think the public are demanding that we address the concerns of the industry. And I'm not sure your robust analytical framework is really doing it for me and really understanding that is going to give us the outcomes we want. So I'm not trying to draw comparisons. What I'm saying is that traffic light system really easily understandable, and could it be adopted in a different way, in a Scottish context, here, so that we can put all of it together, mortality, the disease risk, the environmental risk, the wild salmon population, and then, you know, the assessors, when they go out on the ground, can say, right, we've got persistent high mortality here, so we're going to move to an amber. Or we're clear that the seabed is being damaged here, so we'll move to an amber. Does that make sense? Like, why can't we adopt a model like that?
I think I understand the point that you're trying to get to. Again, that model would never provide all that because it wasn't designed to. It was designed to come up with a definition about, well, first of all, to discover, is this a problem for Scotland that we need to try and address? So, again, that model had a very specific purpose rather than being broadened out to cover everything. It's that, I think, are you trying to get to this overall package of overall industry performance? I think what I'm trying to get to is that with all the robust regulation in place, well, first of all, outlining that, some of the processes that go into it in managing some of these concerns, as well as the other frameworks, the work that we're doing to improve consenting and taking all these different factors into consideration. Again, pulling that all together, or is it about how we display that information? I mean, I think it's
about sending a clear message that government is genuinely trying to make sure this industry is viable in the future, but also protecting our landscape, our seabed and everything else, and ensuring the welfare of the salmon population. Maybe I'm alone on this committee. I need to wrap up because I'm getting looked at by the convener. But I don't think from everything, there's a lot of words that have been said this morning, but I just don't think we're actually pushing at the pace we need, or it's coming together in a package that people can really grasp and say, okay, I see where we're going. I just don't think it's there. You said there was robust regulation. If there is, then it's very bitty and it's all over the place, and I'm not sure it's there in one place since the 2018 report. Maybe I'm alone in thinking that, but I just don't think there is.
But I think that we're looking for simple solutions to what are really complex problems that have taken us years to try and grapple and also try to address. We're talking about an ever-changing environment, the regulatory landscape. I mean, we have undertaken, I think, to suggest that there hasn't been progress, you're right. We've spoken about a lot of different areas this morning because that shows, I think, the sheer volume and significance of some of the massive pieces of work that we have undertaken. And this has been ongoing for years as well. When you look at the overall progress that we've made on sea lice, on transparency, on the data that we collect, as well as all the commitments that we are still to take forward. I know that there's more to do, but there is no one simple solution that is going to solve that when we're dealing with such complex matters. Again, we're always looking at other models, what's working elsewhere, and what Jill was talking about. We're comparing with a model that came from a completely different genesis. And I think what I'm trying to demonstrate is the work that we have taken forward, that we're delivering on the commitments that we have made. Yes, I think there will always be that call for us to go further and faster on pieces of work. We have finite resource. We have to prioritise that as best we can and address the key issues as we see them, as well as trying to identify if those key issues exist, which again, coming back to that persistent high mortality work and what that was about.
I have to be quiet now.
Yeah, at the risk of every committee member summing up what we've heard over the last 2 years, I think we'll draw that to a conclusion. Edward Mountain, your questions, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. And I'll just also remind members that I'm a Director on the Fisheries Management Scotland. Can I just say that I welcome the committee's interest in mortality, and it actually reflects exactly what was undertaken by the REC Committee in 2018. And I could draw the Cabinet Secretary's attention to Recommendation 10, which relates to this. where it talks about having ambitious targets and world-leading to reduce mortality in Scotland. It goes on to say at the end it should consider appropriate mechanisms to allow the limiting or closing down of production until causes of problems relating to mortality are addressed. Mortality at that stage was 3.8 million fish, 7%. Increased to 22, which is in 22 to what the Cabinet Secretary suggested of about 17 million, which is about 25%. Increased again the next year to a higher figure of 7.5 million. Dropped a bit in 2004 and shot up again in 2005. So we've got mortality somewhere around 20 to 25%. What is the figure that the government will put on an acceptable level of percentages of the fish stock dying in pens of Scotland?
Again, I think this is a question that we touched on when I previously appeared in front of the committee, because, and I would just reiterate the response that I'd made then, it's about us driving down mortality to the lowest possible levels. Are any of these levels acceptable? No. I want to see them driven down to the absolute lowest they can be. And again, that's what the work that we've taken forward, trying to identify if there are persistent issues and how best to address them, has been about.
Well, what we're seeing is the figures are remaining stubbornly high, well above the numbers that the REC Committee considered to be totally unacceptable. I mean, if you translated that to other stock across Scotland, that's, 6.5 million sheep in Scotland. If 1.5 million were found dead on the hills across Scotland every year, would the government find that acceptable, or would they take action against it?
And we're not comparing like with like when we're talking about these scenarios. It's about driving down mortality to the lowest possible levels. And again, that's where the focus of our work has been. And that's ultimately what it's about. Trying to identify if there are persistent issues that we need to try and address. But there is significant investment and work that's ongoing to try and get ahead of problems where they can exist and to try and drive that down.
So my final question, Convener, if I may, is that I want to propose to you that if the figure got to 10% and there were pens across Scotland where 10% was being exceeded in every single production cycle, and I can point you to a few, Cabinet Secretary, I'm going to resist the temptation to do that. Do you think that would be a figure that would be acceptable, or do you see it should be lower? And if it is 10%, will you say to them, as the REC Committee suggested and as this committee has suggested, that production should stop?
Sorry, you mean 10%? What would that be an acceptable level of
mortality?
Again, we haven't set a threshold, and we're not looking at establishing those thresholds, because there are so many different causes that can lead to mortality events. And for me, the key focus is how are we addressing that? Is action being taken to prevent that from happening? And on the back of these events, is action being taken as a result to ensure it doesn't happen again? And that's where the focus of the work is, and what we're trying to drive forward and make sure that we're driving them to the lowest possible levels. With
respect, Cabinet Secretary, if 25% of my cows died every year, I'd be out of business, and I wouldn't want to continue because I'd be sickened by it, and I'll probably just leave it at that.
Culture, but I believe the Cabinet Secretary would like to make some closing remarks.
Well, it was really just to say that this is going to be my last time appearing in front of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee, not my final committee appearance overall, but I really just wanted to thank you, Convener, and also thank the members around the table. I can't always say it's been a pleasure sitting on the end of the table and receiving the various different topics that we've had, but I know that committee members will be aware that it's a very broad-reaching portfolio. I've always welcomed the scrutiny that the committee has undertaken, and really just want to wish all the best to those of you who are stepping down, and all the best of you to you who are standing for re-election elections in May. And thank you all so much for working alongside me. I think we've done some significant pieces of work in that time, and really just to say thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. From my personal point of view, over the almost 10 years that I've known you, you've always enabled civil and respectful debate. Without, on any occasion, I can remember that discussion turning hostile, and that's a credit to you, given some of the intensive questioning that we've had round this table. I think we can agree that you've disagreed, or we've disagreed agreeably, which is to be commended. And I'm sure I can speak for everyone around the table and convener thank you for the way you've engaged with the committee over the years and your engagement with the committee on some pretty heavy topics over the years, and we all wish you very well in your future and whatever that might hold for you. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I now suspend the meeting to allow for a changeover of witnesses and a 5-minute comfort break. I suspend. Our next item on the agenda is consideration of petition PE 1490, lodged by the Scottish Crofting Federation, which calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to address the problems created by increasing populations of wild geese. The committee last considered the petition back in May 2024 and agreed to await Nature Scots delivery plan as part of its review of the National Goose Management Framework before taking further evidence at that stage. So at today's meeting, we'll hear from officials involved in developing the plan to discuss how it will address issues raised in the petition. And a welcome to the meeting, Donald Fraser, who's the head of Wildlife Management from Nature Scot, and Sam Turner, who's the team leader from the Wildlife Management team in the Scottish Government. We've allocated around an hour for this session, so I'll kick off just to set the scene. Can you give us an update on the population status of the different goose species, and has there been any significant changes in recent years?
Kick off with that. So obviously there are a number of different species present in Scotland. Some of them are resident populations and some of them come from international populations or shared populations. So current kind of estimates of Scottish populations of Greenland barnacle geese, the last full census was done in 2023, about just under 50,000. Svalbard barnacle geese in census in 2021 was about 36,000. The Greenland white-fronted goose, 8,000 in 2025. The greylag, we've got two populations of greylag. We've got a breeding population, which is estimated across Scotland at around just under 50,000. Then we've got a wintering population, which comes in from Iceland, which there's been some changes in that, but certainly around the last estimate was in 2023, around 55,000, but that could be more than that. And then we've got pinkfoot geese, which is around 270,000 that come into Scotland for wintering. So that was in 2021. But in terms of the actual kind of trends in those populations, there's some significant changes that have been happening over that time. For a number of different reasons, we have seen increases in greylag goose in terms of our resident population, but there have been some concerns about reductions and declines in Icelandic populations. Pinkfoot geese has been doing well, really, over that time, and we've seen sustained populations of that coming in. Greenland barnacle and barnacle geese in general, there have been concerns about declines in barnacle geese. Most significant recent issue has been around avian influenza, which was in 2023, and that's impacted on that, although we are seeing some changes in terms of responses to that now in the last couple of years. So it's quite a mixed picture there, I think, in terms of goose populations overall, and it's, you know, there's spatial and temporal differences there in terms of how they're doing.
Yeah. When it comes to the greylag, which would appear to have the highest population and the one that's often focused on when it comes to agricultural damage, can you give us an idea why there's maybe a change between those who are resident, if you like, and those that migrate? Is that got to do with weather conditions, climate change, where these birds are just staying, they're not actually then heading back to Iceland or whatever? Is that something that you see?
Yeah, I mean, so the highest numbers we're getting is pinkfoot geese, but you're right in terms of the impacts that we're seeing in some of the increase in resident population. Greylag is the bigger issue in Scotland. There's some suggestion that is down to climate factors, so short stopping. So instead of going further south to winter, greylag populations are staying in more northern parts of Scotland, Orkney and kind of Caithness and Sutherland. So we're seeing some increased populations further north as a result of, you know, warmer winters essentially. So we think that is one of the factors that is affecting population distribution or changing. Yeah.
You touched on avian flu and potentially different management approach there had to be because of avian flu. Has there been any changes in international obligations or national obligations which have affected how the populations could be managed since the last update?
So, in terms of grey lag specifically, so I mentioned there was concern about declines in Icelandic population. So there has been through the EWA process in the European Goose Management Platform a change in status of Icelandic grey lag goose to A*, which means that there recognition of a decline, a potential decline in population, and the need for further measures to manage that. So what that essentially means is that we've got to put in place a management plan for that, working with international partners in Iceland to make sure that we are putting in adequate protection for those species. Now, the first part of that is getting a better handle on what the numbers are of the species. We've been doing a bit of work with Iceland jointly in that, doing some satellite tagging of birds to get a better handle on where populations are, and developing the kind of methodology for better understand that population. So that there has been a status change. So the status change you talked about is the A* with grey lag, yeah.
Yeah. So that change in status, given that the petition's here because effectively because of the impact on crofting agriculture and you know, wider concerns about the loss of native grassland or species because that seed base or whatever's not there, does this one-star species status then potentially make it more difficult to achieve the outcomes that this petition would like to see?
Not necessarily. So it's about putting in place a management plan that deals with potential declines in population, but also managing impact. So that's where we're at in that. Mm-hmm. If the population declines significantly and is seen to decline significantly, we would have to put in measures to make sure that we're protecting that international population. But in terms of the area, there's still the resident and the international population that we're dealing with there. So measures which can be targeted at resident populations can continue because there's a time and where that can take place to kind of specifically target those geese. But yes, potentially there are protections that we need to put in place, but we're not at that stage yet, certainly.
Okay, that's really helpful. Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, Convener. And just in terms of species moving or staying north, I can say we've certainly seen more in Shetland in recent times. My question is, I wonder if you could explain the delay in the 2022, the publication of the 2022 review and the delivery plan, and what the reaction has been of members of the National Goose Forum to the documents.
Yeah, so we published the policy review back in 2024. I think one thing to clarify is that although publication of the documents has been delayed, they have been circulated with local goose management group members. So there's been a lot of work, a lot of stakeholder engagement with the local management group members on developing the documents and producing the recommendations in the documents. So although it was sort of unfortunate that the publication of some of them have been delayed, so the management plan is due to be published over the next couple of weeks. There has been work going on in the background with stakeholders on them. So, yeah, it has been a bit unfortunate, but we have been sort of trying to keep stakeholders engaged as we've been doing that.
I wonder if you could say, you know, what the responses have been. Are you able to say?
So there's been a bit of frustration from stakeholders because a lot of work has gone into the documents and gone into the actions from the documents, but there's still been work going on in the background, so the schemes have continued to roll over in terms of the schemes which support farmers and crofters to host protected species, and also the schemes which help with the management of resident greylag geese. So there has been that going on. There's also continued knowledge sharing while we've been working on these recommendations. So I think I know that the local group members on Tyree and Coll are learning from what is going on in Orkney in terms of different methodologies for controlling resident greylag. So that work has still been going on in the background while we've been pulling, I guess, the sort of the policy review and the delivery plan together and getting that out there.
I mean, just to say, I think there was a National Goose Forum meeting on the 12th of February, so in the last few weeks, and I think, you know, from the stakeholder perspective, it's really wanting to see the kind of delivery plan and the recommendations taken forward a bit with pace and urgency is the kind of feedback that we're getting, which I totally accept. And I think the commitments that we made to do that, certainly in terms of the key areas of those recommendations I want to see taken forward around the schemes and the grey lag issue in particular.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you, Convener. A few questions about this. As you'll appreciate, this petition, long-running petition, is of great interest to my constituents. You mentioned there I think you mentioned the National Goose Forum and the delivery plan, and you mentioned the need for swiftness. Obviously, the Scottish Government has recognised the problem that exists in some parts of the country with recent funding, not least that relating to UIST. But do you think that going forward there needs to be a sort of swifter reaction to extreme situations with some species in some locations?
I think the whole goose management, like most wildlife management, is an adaptive process. So it's understanding the issues that crop up and trying to get time-based responses, best and time-based responses to that. So absolutely accept that in terms of doing it. I mean, some of this is tied in with funding as well, inevitably, and resourcing. So there's an element of that needs done, and some time needs to happen for planning and managing that. But certainly in terms of the mechanisms for understanding what the issues are, understanding what the solutions are, and try to find the methods for doing it, absolutely, I think we're absolutely committed to doing that.
Thank you. As I alluded to, this is something that people raise very regularly with me, and I'm sure with you, in places like specifically the Western Isles. And obviously a particular issue has arisen in UIST, where certainly people have come to me, and I'm sure have come to you, commenting on the impact of one species, grey lag geese, not merely making agriculture difficult, but actually threatening the viability of traditional forms of agriculture imminently. Close cropping, the use of seed types that have been used in UIST for the last 2,500 years may simply not be available in a few years' time if something is not done to deal with the rising numbers of grey lag geese. So, as I say, it's very welcome that there's funding there, but are you, as an organisation, alive to the fact that there is now this imminent concern in some places about the very viability of the whole idea of agriculture?
Yes, so absolutely. And in the UIST case, certainly the funding that's been made available there. There's a number of factors, geese being a significant one, which is obviously impacting on the mackerel and the seed availability in that. But there's a number of factors involved in that. Geese have been a predominant one. And again, it's about making sure, so we've, since 2012, we've been involved in various different methods of trying to do adaptive management, testing, piloting, getting reductions down in areas, and being successful in some areas of doing that and getting populations down. Some of the challenges then in sustaining that, and unfortunately, post those adaptive management, we had COVID, where there was a bit of a hiatus there in terms of being able to actually continue on that management, which has had an impact on populations building again. But one of the challenges that we do have forward is making sure that we've got that sustained management, so that we don't don't take the foot off of what is needing to be done, and we've got that resource and capability there to maintain that populations.
Finally, Convener, when we're looking at, or when you're looking at solutions to arrive at what might be considered sustainable numbers of grey lag geese in some locations, is the only alternative that you're looking at the shooting of geese and the finding of shooters, or if not, what are you open to looking at in the future as other alternatives?
So there's a number of methods that are available, and not all of them are practical in terms of doing that. But there's egg oiling, there's egg removal, there's corralling, which has been done in Orkney, and as I think Sam alluded to there, they're looking at the application of that in other areas potentially. So we're open to other methods that are there available. Whether they can practically be done in some of the locations is some of the issue. But in terms of there's from a Nature Scot perspective, we've looked at where there isn't conservation concern, how we deregulate some of that to make sure that there are effective means of controlling populations in those areas. So, yeah, that's moving to general licence, allowing sale of goose meat, aspects of that which we've been working on.
Thank you, Convener.
Yeah, I think the roof's going to stay on. It's getting is just in case anybody's tuning in, we're all looking at the roof very worriedly because the wind is very strong. I'm now going to move on to a question from Ariane Burgess.
In the 2022 review, it recommended that another specific review of support for goose management should take place to ensure the schemes are operating in an equitable and transparent manner. And yeah, to clarify questions around public funding, has this review commenced and has that working group been set up?
I can come in that. So, no, it hasn't.
Not yet.
But it is about to commence, and we committed at the National Goose Forum, as I say, on the 12th of February, to do that and to set that process up, which will involve stakeholders in that process. So there's obviously been a number of areas of work that's been done around, agricultural support, which has been ongoing for some time in terms of that. But the specific aspects around the schemes and payment rates, where it's prioritised, the species involved in it, that's a bit of work that we're just about to initiate. Yeah.
Okay, so once it does get going, what would the programme of work look like?
So the review is basically looking at the current schemes that are there. So of which we've got, the 5 protected area schemes, and then we've got the grey lag aspect as well, which is slightly separate. So we'll look at that in the round to see, where the public finances are that are going into that, which is, about 1.2 million, which is not insignificant. In that, and then there's about the mechanisms that we've got. So quite a lot of those schemes are, have been developed over since 2000, but since 2010 principally, in terms of how they've been set up, how that payment rates work, what they're based on. So there's a bit of review that's required around that. And then there's a bit more of a holistic view looking at, we've mentioned grey lag becoming more of an issue now in terms of, well, if we have limited public funding, which we do, where is that best targeted at and best supported? So there's a bit more of a holistic review required in that, and that will require, the engagement of stakeholders who are involved in current schemes, and impact that might have, but also, in terms of others who are suffering impacts now that weren't 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay, thanks very much.
Rhoda Grant.
The significance of refreshing the key objectives of the goose management policy, and what implications will that have for goose management in places like the US, but indeed other places where there's been real damage, not only to, farming and crofting and kind of economic damage, but actually natural environment damage as well.
So yeah, I can pick that one up. So the objectives have been refreshed. They're not sort of totally different from the previous objectives from the previous review, but what they do is, by updating them, it ensures that we sort of keep in line with ongoing government policy, so in line with our agricultural objectives and in line with our biodiversity and climate objectives as well. So what we've basically done is made sure that we are sort of, I guess, keeping in line with other government policy across the board and making sure that we're dovetailing into that in terms of managing geese and also looking after our agricultural production. So the objectives are the sort of, I guess, sort of broader picture sort of strategy that we're sticking to, and then the recommendations out of the review are the specific things that we're going to be looking at. So I think the review found that our overall approach is sort of consistent, and we're wanting to stay broadly in line with that, but that there are these specific recommendations and specific issues like the increasing resident grey lag population that we're wanting to do more work on and develop.
So there's not, we don't anticipate huge change, which kind of suggests we'll be managing this issue going forward in kind of what feels like a bit of a piecemeal approach? Or is there going to be a change to kind of see how we can get this under control so that we can manage it at a reasonable level going forward? It just feels like it has getting out of control?
So I think in terms of your question about the objectives, there isn't a huge there is a change in the objectives in the policy review. You can see the two sets of objectives next to each other. So the ones from the previous review in 2017 and then the updated ones in 2022. So they are broadly similar. However, they have been updated in line with developments in government policy over the last 5 years. So the objectives are the sort of the broader actions in terms of trying to manage that conflict between agriculture and protected and sort of lesser protected geese species. But the recommendations are the things that we're going to be taking forward in terms of actions off the back of the review. And there are some quite sort of, I guess, fairly significant changes in terms of the recommendations. So I think, as Dr. Allen acknowledged, there's changes in there around greylag management. So there are going to be delivery plans around national populations for the species, including greylags, and also a specific recommendation and in there about managing greylag geese. So that is a sort of, I guess, a bit of a step change in terms of the policies around the geese, which I think historically have focused more on protected species, but now there's this acknowledgement and consideration of the issue of greylags and how we manage that with the resources that we've got.
Okay. So, just a couple of points. It's probably just to recognise that, the context in which we're operating has changed since 2000. Certainly, in terms of biodiversity and climate being a key part of that, and some of the schemes development around that, particularly around use of nitrogen and pieces like that, need to be taken into account in terms of the schemes going forward. But the wider point is just about, you're right, in terms of a more holistic approach to goose management in Scotland. So, instead of single species issues, but getting a more holistic look at that in terms of where priorities are, where impacts are, and the kind of planning ahead for some of that, which has been done through this work, will help kind of make that more a managed process.
Thank you.
Emma Roddick.
This management policy review states that management schemes would end in April 2023, but the Scottish Government has suggested that funding's continued in the interim. What does that actually look like on the ground, and how has work continued within that period of kind of not knowing what's going on?
The schemes have continued since then, so the last 2 years, and there's a kind of commitment to look at that, to continue that for this year. So on the same basis that they've continued. So the review that we're talking about will look at, does there need to be changes in that? But the funding the funding that has gone into it, as I said, is about 1.2 million, so that's sustained. So it's sustained at the same levels. Now, obviously, some of the stakeholders are looking for increases in that because costs have risen around that time. But the schemes themselves have been rolled forward on an annual basis, and clearly some of our stakeholders again are looking for that continuity and assurance that that will continue in the medium to longer term to kind of plan ahead for that. So. That's one of the aspects that we'll have to look at in terms of the future funding mechanisms that are there and the funding around that. But the schemes as they've currently gone have been rolled over on an annual basis.
Does that work for both parties, though? Does it make sense in terms of just carrying on but not really committing any further forward than that moment?
I mean, I think in an ideal scenario we would have longer term schemes, but at the moment, due to the way that the sort of the limitations that we've got in terms of government finances, is that we are limited to single year schemes at the moment. So it's obviously not ideal, but it's the sort of the situation that we're in at the moment in terms of the expectation that we can provide.
I suppose though the fact that it has continued over every year shows that it is needed.
Yeah, and I think there's the intention to continue the schemes as well. There is a recommendation to look into longer term schemes. So there is a recommendation, I can't remember what number it is, which sets out the consideration of that and I guess what that would offer in terms of benefits.
I mean, I would say that, there's a consistency of approach that's taken place in the last couple of years. But again, looking forward in terms of what that future funding looks like, there will need to be some kind of transition period for that because, the business support that's been there has been there for quite a long time. So some transition element will need to occur in that as well.
Has there been assessment of any costs that could be incurred as a result of not continuing schemes?
So there's been assessment in terms of agricultural impacts that have been done for various locations, not on a Scotland-wide basis, but for various locations. So some of the scheme areas have had kind of impact assessments done or economic impact assessments done for them. Some of them are a bit dated as well. But yes, so it is looking at as I say, in forward looking, we'll look at where the impacts are going to be located and looking at the kind of geographic and spatial element of that.
Alistair Allen. I beg your pardon, I had a supplement from Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Just on the back of Emma Roddick's question, actually, I think the Scottish Government announced an extra £20,000, which brings up the funding to £30,000 total. And as you're saying, it would be better if it was recurrent funding, and so there would then be more, I suppose, more ability to then manage it. So what is the additional funding used for? What is the plan for that?
Yeah, so there's been an additional £20,000 given this year for a specific acute problem on the Uists around managing the impact of greylags, and that's been mainly as a result of not enough seed being harvested and ensuring that there's sort of specific traditional type of seed that ensures that maca cropping system can continue next year. So that's obviously a sort of small part of the overall goose budgets, but for the greylag budgets is quite significant. So ideally, we would be able to continue to offer increased budgets, but as Donald outlined earlier, we have got a limit on the budgets that we can sort of, I guess, play around with and utilise. So that is to try and deal with this sort of acute problem and get the greylag numbers sort of managed over the next year or two, so that issue sort of is alleviated.
So supporting agriculture, but also managing the geese population to reduce the number of greylag geese.
So on the greylag, that's almost exclusively for population reduction. So that's not payments to farmers. That's about the control of the species. So these are to the local goose management groups for control of the species, and that's what it is for. That's what will be delivered for Uist over the next 2 years to support that population reduction. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Convener. Picking up on some of what's been said there just now, the goose management policy review describes how the management schemes were due to come to an end in 2023. There's obviously been very welcome funding since then that's continued schemes into the future. Can I just ask about going forward, and I realise there's a limit to how far you can look forward. Going forward, how much we can or should plan around some kind of sustained, consistent approach to this environmental issue. I realise funding is year to year inevitably, but how we can sustain that going forward in a sustainable way.
So I think that's recognised in the policy review, which is what I was alluding to before, is that this is now a sort of integral part of goose management policy in terms of consistent greylag management. So as I think has been set out to the I'm not sure it was this committee or the petitions committee before by Nature Scott, we obviously had trials running from 2012 to 2017. I think the idea behind those trials, those sorts of pilot projects on greylag management, was to provide local goose management groups with the techniques and the methodologies to allow them to sort of sustainably and, with limited support from Nature Scott, manage the populations, whereas we're in a bit of a different position now where I think we've recognised that there is going to need to be that ongoing government support and intervention. So on a sort of strategic level, that is going to be it is in goose management policy now as it's in the review. There is also a recognition that resident greylags will move around as well. So although there are acute problems in certain parts of Scotland, they will still move between certain islands. So just tackling them in one area when there's an acute flare-up isn't really going to be sustainable, and that we are going to need to do more to address it on a national scale.
finally, Convener, on that point about going forward and thinking forward, I know this is something you do as an organisation, but this is an unusual example of something where there is a kind of shared interest between crofters and environmentalists, because the landscape that is provided by crofting or provided by traditional low-intensity agriculture is the environment that's needed by the bird species in which you take an interest as an organisation too. So I wonder if you could say any more about how you intend to try to build that useful coalition.
Absolutely right. I think there's a lot of interest from the likes of the RSPB in ensuring that the grey leg numbers are sort of managed appropriately, especially where there's maca cropping. So I've had a number of meetings with the RSPB recently and looking at what can be done in terms of this. I know I'm waiting for a report from them on the sort of feasibility of the sale of goose meat, because I think that's something that we're keen to utilise where possible. However, I know it's limited. So I know the RSPB have done a lot of work over the years in terms of protecting the maca and making sure that habitat is protected. So we'll be keen to work with all stakeholders on this.
Thank you.
Just finally, we heard Emma Harper welcoming the £20,000. That's for a specific thing. It's not increasing funding, so it can't be dressed up as that. What is really concerning is when we look at the key projects and priorities for the period 25 to 30, in recommendation 5, it states that management approach to goose management will require medium-term commitment as opposed to year-on-year to allow farmers and crofters to plan management of their business. Critically, it says future support will depend on funding being discussed in line with changes that are being made to the agricultural support. Then it goes on to say, and we know this, the wider concern is that transition from current arrangements towards future rural support is unlikely to be ready before 2030. So what's your views that actually we're going to be kind of in limbo and not being able to look at that transition before new support schemes in 2030? That's quite some time down the road.
So I think as Donald set out before, there will be a bit of a transition, but we've still got the current schemes where we're rolling them on a year-to-year basis at the moment. So there's still scope to develop that and to see whether there's anything that can be done in the medium term between now and future agricultural support.
That's far from ideal, isn't it? So you're effectively treading water because we don't have a rural support plan in place or indications of what the rural support is likely to be before 2030.
So I still think we can develop what we've got now, and whilst we are in this period of sort of agricultural support transition, obviously we don't know what that future agricultural support will look like, so we can't commit to anything now in terms of how goose schemes and agricultural support will dovetail together. But there are obviously things that we can be doing in terms of the other recommendations that are set out here and in terms of our ongoing annual schemes to see whether that could be, I guess, shored up.
Yeah, but it's far from a satisfactory situation where effectively we are treading water. We're having to put in interim things because of the failure of the government to set out what that rural support is going to be. So we've got 5 years of less than, when I say less than adequate, less than perfect solutions, ideally because of this lack of a rural support plan.
The future agricultural support is one aspect of it, but the other aspect is the review that we talked about earlier on in terms of, well, what is the current need or future need of that, which is an important bit of work that we need to do. And the actual mechanism for the payment is slightly a side issue. It's more about what is needed and where is it needed going forward, and that's the important bit of work. And then the discussion can happen about what is the mechanisms and the funding levels that are required from that going forward. But I think this first piece of work, which is the recommendations in here, is really important to get that done and concluded.
Okay, thank you. I don't believe I've got any other questions. So thank you very much for joining us. The committee will now go on to consider the next steps in the petition, but I'm going to briefly pause to allow the witnesses to leave. Move on to formal consideration of the next steps on the petition. For this part of the meeting, I'm going to refer members to paragraph 10 of the clerk's note for this item, which invites us to consider closing the petition on the basis that, after hearing from officials, that we're satisfied that the actions set out in Nature Scott's delivery plan and the National Goose Policy Framework will sufficiently address the problems created by increasing populations of wild geese in crofting areas. I would propose that we include something in our legacy paper also to the next sessions committee, who will have responsibility for Nature Scott, to monitor the issue and implementation of the framework and delivery plan. So that would be to close the petition, but include those steps in the legacy plan. Any comments? Are we happy? Thank.
Agree with that. And I think, given that that working group hasn't yet been set up in the area that I was asking questions on, I think that would be one of the areas that would be great for a future committee to take a look at. Okay, thank you. I think we're agreed on that approach. That concludes our business in public today, but before we move into private, given that this is the last committee meeting in public, I just want to put on record my thanks to all the members, some who have been here for the full 5 years and others that have dipped in and out, but thank you all for your contributions. But in particular, and I know it's not generally done, but to actually point out the team that's behind us, and that's the team of clerks. And I believe Emma Johnson has probably been the only one of the team that's been with us right from the start. And I personally want to put on record my huge thanks for Emma for the support she's given me as convener. So through the good times and the bad times and the difficult times, we've had a very legislation-heavy agenda throughout the last 5 years, and without Emma's guidance and her support of the team that sits under her, that task would have been made even more difficult for us. So just to say thank you to the clerks and thank you to everybody who supported the committee and the witnesses we've had over the last 5 years. And we will now move into private session, and I suspend the meeting. Thank you.